Hello and welcome to the Adventure Archive. My name is Ryan, and this is Sersa Victory.
Hey, how's it going?
And tonight we are going to be going over Victory Basic, your new favorite game here on the Adventure Archive. We had an awesome session last week, and unfortunately, with some unforeseen circumstances, Ginger, I hope you feel better soon. We will not be playing this week, but we will be talking all things Victory Basic. So, for those of you who are never going to own this, like us privileged few, this is the Victory Basic box set. And what you'll see in it, I'll just go through this real quick and then we'll get into looking at the game, is the 3-volume set that we've talked about. If you were in any of my morning streams where we were doing some planning, hey, L2, what's going on? You would have seen all of the different books that are in it. Plus, there's a 4th volume coming out soon. But it comes with dice, it comes with pencils, it comes with a stack of character sheets. Get out. There you go. It comes with a piece of grid paper to do some dungeons on. It comes with a fight on card, which has a message for those special enough of us to get the box to read. And then it comes with the 3 volumes of the game. And for anyone who's seen it's the OD&D box set that this mirrors, right? Or is closely resembling.
That's correct, yeah.
You will notice the font is similar, the layout is similar. It is definitely. Am I wrong to say it's definitely an homage to the original like OD&D?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the font
Yeah.
and the layout is meant to mimic the original white box set.
I never played OD&D or the original box set. I do have. Do you know Old School Essentials? Like, because that's as far as I've heard is the closest like retro clone to the original D&D. Am I completely mistaken with that?
Yeah, Old School Essentials is a great game.
Yeah. Definitely want to play that at some point, but a lot prior to that, we are going to continue to play Victory Basic. So I guess the first question I have for you is, why did you make Victory Basic?
Uh, so I created it as a Christmas gift for a couple of friends of mine. A lot of us were fans of the game Dungeon World, and we would often play it to run these kinds of classic old school style dungeon crawls. And I thought it would be neat as a gift for people to take the Dungeon World rules and reskin them, reflavor them, format them style similar to the original OD&D box set with a little bit of the basic D&D stuff thrown in. And it was never meant to be something released publicly. It's not a commercial product. It's not meant to be like a retro clone to compete with something like Swords and Wizardry or OSC or anything like that. And in part, it was deliberately made to be somewhat hard to read because the original OD&D box set was very difficult to parse. And a friend of mine who's a lot more plugged into D&D lore than I am, he actually met somebody at Gen Con or Gary Con or one of these conventions who was one of the first people to actually sell the original Dungeons and Dragons game at a gaming store in like Wisconsin or the Midwest or somewhere. And he remembers getting the original D&D box set and being like, no one's going to buy this. This doesn't make any sense. I don't know what this is supposed to be. Of course, he was wrong. The game flew off the shelves. But there's a lot of stuff in Victory Basic that's like if I was actually making the game for publication, I wouldn't do it that way. Like the different racial abilities. Like there's no table where it specifically says, hey, here's an easy way you can reference what all the different classes and races can do. They're spread across the book, right?
Yeah.
And that's part of the charm, I think, of OD&D is that it's kind of a difficult game to parse. And I kept it that way, right? I wouldn't do it if I was publishing it like that. And like I mentioned, like the fonts were all the same. The booklets mirror the original books, which was Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasures, and Underworld Adventures. And I do have a 4th book coming out called Ancient Legends, which is kind of a mashup of the different supplements like Greyhawk, Eldritch Wizardry, and Blackmoor.
Nice. Yeah, I guess I I guess I realized it was a little bit hard to parse, but didn't realize it was like purposely hard to parse because I had asked you previously. I know I had said, "Hey, could I get some type of basically like DM screen or DM like a reference page so I can parse this out a little bit easier?" And you're like, "Sure, here you go." But I guess I didn't realize that it was purposely done to mimic the original. I guess it makes a little more sense now because yeah, a lot of the things are spread a little bit and like you're pulling pieces out. So it's really funny that or interesting that that's done on purpose to mimic the original. And I like I said, I've never actually got to read the original. I think Eric might have copies of the actual OD&D books and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other reasons that I put it together was, me and a couple other people put out some traditional style dungeon crawl products for Dungeon World and got a lot of flack from the Dungeon World community. We didn't really get along with that community very well. Because in their mind, the way that you had to play Dungeon World was that you didn't have pre-gens, and you didn't prepare ahead of time. So the idea that you would have a dungeon module that was pre-written, that was played competitively as a tournament, and that had pre-generated characters was anathema to Dungeon World. Uh, and so what I wanted to do, for the friends of mine who liked a lot of the basic mechanics of Dungeon World, like the 2d6 system, the gradient of success, those sorts of things, to give us a system that we could use for ourselves that captured the things that we liked about Dungeon World without some of the baggage. And I don't think it was necessarily meant to be something that they could use to publish their own material, because by the time Victory Basic came out, most of us had moved on from publishing a lot of tabletop stuff. But technically, and it says it in the rule book, Victory Basic is Creative Commons. So if somebody really wanted to, they could take the text and make their own products with it or spin their own game off from it. So
Really? Well, I've seen that before. It's literally right in the beginning. It says it's a Creative Commons attribution for international license.
yeah.
But I'm curious, why was I mean, I feel like the OSR community and I guess most of it, at least from what I've read, a lot of them are very like pro, like hack my shit. You know what I mean? Like a lot of games even say like, hack this as much as you can. Like if you look at a game like Tiny Dungeons or Knave or something like that, a lot of them straight up say just like, you know, hack away. I'm curious why Dungeon World was so anti, kind of being hacked in the way that you guys were doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess just for them, the way that Dungeon World was meant to be played was you didn't prepare ahead of time. Uh, it was meant to be something that you kind of collaboratively created at the table. I mean, the rule books pretty much stayed as much. So for them, the idea that you would create like a pre-built adventure module, then run it as written without a whole lot of player input in terms of the story, and use pre-generated characters and run it in a competitive way, for them was like, why wouldn't you just go do something else? Why use our game? And our argument was that there were a lot of really interesting mechanics in Dungeon World that made it especially interesting to play in a way that games like at the time, like OSE wasn't around at that point. But games like Swords and Wizardry or Osric, like one of the things that I really enjoy about like the 2d6 Powered by the Apocalypse type system that you don't get in other kinds of games is the fact that every roll puts you at risk. And I think that's probably the one thing that keeps me from playing a lot of other kinds of games, because in typical D20 type games, most rolls don't have an immediate risk associated with them, and most rolls lack drama. And I was really pleased to hear, I don't remember who it was in the session last week, somebody had said during your game that every roll feels like a saving throw. And that is exactly the point. That every roll feels like something is on the line. And that tension comes from the fact that failure always incurs a move from the referee, from the dungeon master. That it isn't like a typical D20 game where even rolls in very risky situations like making an attack roll, if I fail my attack roll, nothing happens to me immediately, right? Like the monster's still alive, so technically it could retaliate on its turn if it wanted to, but you don't have that immediate dread of I've failed my attack roll. I know something bad's about to happen to me. It's a subtle thing. It's hard to really explain if you haven't played it. But once you start to play a lot of games that use this kind of 2d6, if you roll a 9 or less, the GM gets to retaliate against you. It's really hard to go back and play games where there's no real immediate consequences for your roll unless you're making an explicit thing like a saving throw. So that's something that we loved from games like Dungeon World. And we wanted to bring that into our old school type games. There's some other stuff as well. Like we really liked, you and I were talking before the stream just now about the way monster stat blocks were constructed.
Mm-hmm.
The way that they work in Dungeon World, and I carry that over to Victory Basic, is that when you build a monster, there's very few stats. They have kind of their damage die, their hit dice, they have an instinct, which is kind of just like their drive and their tactics all rolled into one. So I think one example like could be a mind flayer, and it's just like dominate other creatures, and you can roll with that with a lot of things. And then their individual moves, you don't have like these really explicitly detailed lists of moves. It's just like, okay, a mind flayer can suck the brain out of a creature, emit a psychic blast, issue a telepathic command. They're just bullet points, and you just make up like 4 or 5 of them. And then as you're running the encounter, you as the GM use the basic rules of the game system to adjudicate how those different powers come into play. And it allows you to really mix it up in the combat to create these very dynamic feeling encounters. And again, that's something that I think a lot of people noticed in your session last week. A lot of people use the phrase like, I enjoyed the chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so one of the things you said about rolling with consequences, that's my favorite part. That is absolutely my favorite part, especially Victory Basic. And also, like, just knowing you, like, as long as I've known you now and played the games that you've played and read the things that you write, like, I feel like it's a perfect Sersa Victory mechanic. I feel like every roll has a consequence feels very Sersa Victory to me. Because a lot of things you write, like, that, it's kind of written into the story if it's not written into the mechanics. You know what I mean? To be able to always feel tension, to always feel risk, and to make sure that every choice you make, that they're not meaningless. And I feel like a 2d6, like, literally, like, all you have to do, like, every roll you make forces that choice, at least in a small degree. Like, do I want to make this roll right now and potentially risk failing, or do I not want to? And the fact that those choice things come into play literally like that frequently in it makes Victory Basic feel, to me, like I said, very Sersa Victory. And yeah, we were talking about the monster stat blocks and everything. When I was first starting Victory Basic, for those that didn't know, I had a little Discord message with Sersa going, because the same thing with Victory Basic happened the same time that I ran Casket Lands or was a player in like Monster of the Week, right? Is my brain has played 5e for so long, it's kind of hard to wrap around that kind of improv mechanic of, like, there is nothing that specifically says this is what happens. You get to make it up. But it's kind of like, it takes a little bit for your brain to kind of unwind from that 5e thing and then wrap around this 2d6 thing where you can just be free. You can do whatever. You can respond however you feel, and that those monster stat blocks basically give you options, but also a vibe for what the creature is supposed to be doing, which is so much better. In my opinion, it's much more free than 5e, and especially, I was already, anyone that knows me knows that I've been over 5e for a while. But especially after, prepping and going through Victory Basic as in depth as I did this time and running it again, the second I finished, I was like, fuck, I'm just so over 5e. You know what I mean? Like, this is so much more fun. This is so much more interesting. Like you said, there's so much more tension. People are so much more, I feel like, kind of invested because there are no meaningless roles. Every role creates tension and creates chaos. So these kind of systems, or very specifically this game, is what I prefer to run now for all the reasons that you just said that you created it. Um, so yeah. And hello, Andy. How's it going, man? So after you watched our session, I know that you helped me thoroughly prep. We still actually have a little bit of prep to do before next week, and I don't know if anyone's here from the game, so I don't want to give spoilers away. But after watching our session last week, do you feel that? How do you feel about watching someone else play the game that you created? I guess.
I thought it was great. Yeah, I think really captured what I think the game is about, which is the chaos. I feel like with games like OD&D and basic D&D, um, you and I talked about this a little bit when we were doing the prep. It's the emphasis is not on a predefined narrative that you move the players through, and there's not really uh, a sense of progressing these characters through an arc, but rather, I don't know if you mentioned this to the players or said it explicitly, but I think almost everything that they encountered in that play session was randomly generated.
Yeah. We
And
talked
the
about that a little bit,
fact
and I was
that,
like, yeah, like 80% of this was randomly generated. Then I was like, wait a minute. I think we actually randomly generated that other 20% too. I think we just tweaked it a little bit after it was done. So yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm almost positive everything was randomly generated because even the dungeon layout, I flipped through a bunch of different dungeons on like Donjon to find like one that roughly I kind of liked. So even the layout was partially randomly generated and then just tweaked with you and me. So yeah, I think literally all of it was. So
yeah, and I think it's fun to have that novelty in a play session. I mean, because that's what I like to do when I'm running the game. Like I love having random tables at hand, especially when it comes to magic items. And so what I often do when I'm running games in person is I don't even roll up treasure hoards until the players actively like find them. Like they throw open the treasure chest. Like I'll know, okay, there's a major cache in here. But if it's not like one of the main, artifacts in the dungeon level, I'll just wait until they actually open it. And more often than not, the items they get will change their play strategy or introduce kind of interesting, new complications. Like there was one I was running a Tomb of Horrors remix. The power went out once when I had a bunch of friends over, and I was like, "Well, we're kind of stuck here. We're snowed in. Let's just play Tomb of Horrors." And I remember they were fighting a mummy, and there was like, "Okay, I want to go into the sarcophagus," and I'm like, "Okay, we'll roll D100." And they got an item that was like animate dead, where they can animate 1D100 skeletons. And I think the player rolled a 100 and animated 100 skeletons, and they used it to like defeat the mummy lord. And they had these 100 skeletons, and they made their way through the tomb, and it just totally changed the nature of the play session. And it's fun because you can't predict it as the GM, and you get to have fun. Because I think, for a lot of game masters, because you're kind of the one that's building out the story, you can't be surprised as often. I still think for a lot of GMs, if you're really into the more narrative focused play, there's probably still a lot of enjoyment in it. But for me personally, I love kind of having that roguelike feeling almost of I kind of know at a high level what's going to happen in this session, but there's still a lot of stuff where moment to moment, I'm not even sure what's going to happen. And that
Well,
creates a lot of exciting moments. Again, the chaos that it seems like, that's a word that seemed to have come up a lot in people's reactions to the game last week.
yeah, well, I'm falling more and more in love every day with random roll tables. Every time you find them, like especially in like the OSR style games, um, they're great. And it's not one of the things that I really, there's a couple of things that I just despise about 5e. I'm always going to love 5e. It is the game that got me into tabletop role playing game and stuff like that. It's just, I'm not going to get into what it's become and stuff. But one of the things I always disliked from the very beginning was the random encounter tables, because I always felt like in 5e, if I wanted them to fight something, I would have them fight something, because I would always want it to make sense in the story. And I feel like it's almost the opposite of that for these OSR style games. And the random roll tables get to bring in, like you just said, like a sense of chaos that is not often found in something like 5e, where you do kind of plan out every meticulous part of the story. And now, after you said that, I kind of want to just toss out all of the treasures that I rolled already and literally just roll them on stream just so I can do that. Because I think for me, running Victory Basic in these 2d6 games as a GM is just a lot more fun, for part of the reason that you just said, that you don't even know what's going to happen sometimes, as opposed to having things planned out, for the most part, or planned out in minute detail. And the fact that you don't even know the treasure they're going to get and how it's going to affect your game is super interesting. And it makes me feel more like just another player as opposed to the GM, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And with the Wandering Monster things in 5th edition, I mean, I think a lot of people have the same reaction to them as you do, which is, I don't really understand why these are here. They don't really see the value of them. And I think that's a legitimate feeling to have, because they are, I think, vestigial in the game.
Mm-hmm.
Because by and large, 5th edition is not played in a way where Wandering Monster tables make sense, because you have to go back to why they exist in the first place. So in a game like OD&D or Basic or Victory Basic, time and movement and things like resting, they are resources to be managed, right? And so, use Victory Basic as an example. Each time you rest, it's not taken for granted that you'll be able to rest safely. It's a choice that you have to make. And the stick, right, on the other end of that choice is, you can rest if you feel like you're running low on spells or hit points, or equipment in the case of humans, because they can regain their equipment. You're going to risk wandering monsters. And that's true in games like OD&D. Like when you take time, so okay, yeah, you can check for traps, but the counterbalance to that and that mechanic is you take up time, and every certain number of turns you check for wandering monsters. And it wasn't just there, just to be a table you can roll on for fun. Like, it served a really important point, a purpose in the game's mechanics. And that's something that isn't obvious, because the game's not played that way anymore. Hasn't been played like that for a long time.
Right.
There's another thing. Go on.
No, sorry. The more I learn, what's interesting is the more I learn about 5e, or the more I learn about older editions of the game and game design and stuff like that. It's interesting when you can learn about something in an older edition and be like, that's why 5e does that, and that's why it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because it's almost kind of like shoehorning, trying to be a callback, kind of. Specifically for these random encounters, I always use them more as like a vibe. Like, these are the things that you might find in this area, and they can be almost like a prompt. It's just like, oh, okay, well, in these woods there are wolves. So if I want them to have an encounter, I'll have a wolf. But learning them, like you just like one of the things you just talked about, how they were actually created, what they were there for, and why they are kind of the way they are in 5e. It makes a lot more sense, especially with a lot of the things that, like I just said, like don't really make sense, and then you go, oh, now I see why they're there in the first place. So
Yeah, and then with roll tables, those can be difficult to build. There's this concept in the procedural generation world. You hear about this when you dig into like roguelikes, and other kinds of like computer procedural generation. It's called like the oatmeal problem, where you can have a table or an algorithm that generates, hundreds of thousands or millions of like magic items, for example. But if they aren't meaningfully different from the player's perspective, if they're all just like this like gray bowls of oatmeal, then you've not really done very good procedural generation. And I think the same is true for roll tables. Why I think a lot of roll tables can feel kind of bland, because you can have, for example, this is kind of how I feel about a lot of random dungeon generators, where yeah, it could technically generate millions of different dungeon levels in terms of maps, but the layouts aren't really meaningfully distinct from one another. And so you just kind of have all these just a thousand bowls of oatmeal, right?
right.
And same can be true of magic items or monsters. And so that's something like with this fourth book, I'm really trying to dial in on, I just don't want to add a random table just to add a random table. I want to make sure that table provides people like you something where the result of me rolling on this table is going to have a meaningful, significant impact on the play experience. That's something that will be discernible by the players. That it's something that, because of the result of rolling on this table, that's going to change the way that they're going to engage with the game. And, an example is going to be like the random properties of magical gems. You know what I mean? Like I could have just had it where it's like, okay, well, it could be a ruby or an amethyst or whatever. And that's not super interesting. But because each gem has a different sort of magical, like, okay, well, some of these gems can control undead, or some of these gems can provide, restful sleep or protect from enchantments or communication or those sorts of things. By possessing, let's say they find a magic sword and you roll, okay, well, there's a gem in the hilt. Oh, it's command undead. That can radically transform a session.
Oh yeah.
Or even a campaign, depending on what kind of, weapon it is or whatever. And so, or same with dungeon layout. Like there's a really great roguelike called Unexplored that really looked into this concept called cyclic dungeon generation, that said, I'm going to get away from just putting rectangles on a screen and connecting those rectangles with hallways, and focused more on these sort of interesting cycles from a gameplay perspective. And we actually use one of those, and this isn't really spoilery, but we use one of these in the generation of the dungeon level that the players are in now. And it's called the dramatic cycle. And this is something that you see in all kinds of games, where player can see something that they want. They can see there's an item or there's a place they want to go. They can't get to it yet. Something in the way, hard lock or a soft lock. Then later they find a way to get to it, and it's like, oh, I made it. That's how you get there, right? And the generator that the developer of Unexplored built can actually build those kinds of cycles. There's a number of other cycles like that. And the game was praised because the levels were like, yeah, this feels like an actual human designer built this. It doesn't just feel like a computer spit out a million random arrangements of rectangles and lines, but it actually feels like these levels were designed with gameplay in mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Yeah, one of the things, so when we were building the dungeon, every time I'm doing anything with this game, I'm always like, in my head, I'm like, what would Sersa do? What would Sersa do? Like, what did we talk about? We talked about closed loops. We talked about this. We talked about that. And you were there with me building it, which is fantastic. But one of the things you mentioned previously was Rogue, um, and I loved when I read through Victory Basic, especially this time, and actually started prepping for it. I can't tell you how often I just imagined Rogue in my head, and I was like, if I could play, and the number of times I played Rogue and was like, man, if I could play this game, if I could do this as like a tabletop game, this is the game I would want to play. And I feel like Victory Basic kind of is that game, like with a party a little bit, because of the random rolls and stuff like that, how we randomly generated the entire thing. But part of what you're talking about is it doesn't feel like a bowl of oatmeal. Like with the roll tables that you've put in the game, there's not one of the things I like is they're not all like D20 roll tables, right? There's a D20 roll table, but sometimes it's just a D6 or a D8, and I don't feel like there's ever a single one of those things where it's like, that one's okay, but this other one's way more fun. You know what I mean? Whether it's a D6 table or a D8 table or a D20 table, sometimes every single one feels distinct and super important and super interesting. So it's like getting to do kind of a randomly generated situation, but all of the options you have are distinct and bold and super, super interesting. So
Yeah, and a big part of it too is like trying to put different game systems. This is going to be such. I feel like such a nerd when I say things like this. Putting game systems in conversation with one another, right? That's an expensive sentence. So I have my notebook here, and for the fourth book, like I said, I could have just put a bunch of tables where it's like, here's a bunch of random swords, right? Like, oh, it's a fire sword, it's an ice sword. But what I really wanted to do was, okay, what can I do to create tables that put the different game systems, get them to interact with one another. So what I literally did was I just put all the different game systems and rules into like a big like table on the computer, and then did like the Cartesian product where it's like just show me every single game system paired off with every single other one, and wrote down the most interesting combination. So I'm going to read to you a couple ideas that I wrote down. I don't know if these will make it into the book, but this is just some stuff that came up. Wandering traps, wondrous dungeon features, dungeon lord henchmen, possessed rings, wondrous doors, astral projection, monster intelligence. Like, the idea is just, how can I come up with interesting ways where you have these different game systems and you can keep them from just existing in isolation, right? Because you want your game systems to interact. You want players to constantly be thinking about, like, the trade-offs between things like, okay, I have equipment, but I also have spells, and I have life points, and I have henchmen, and I have all these different things. I need to think about how to balance all these. I have all these spinning plates in the air that I have to keep going if I'm going to survive the dungeon, So it's just like, coming up with interesting roll tables that are just, I don't know, there's just fun to roll on it, and things that make the game fun to play. Because I'm one of those people that if I ever see like on DM's Guild or drive through, like, hey, here's 100 roll tables and it's $1.99, and I buy it. And more often than not, I don't like to say, as a rule, like bad things about other people's products. I don't like to do that. But in general, I tend not to like those products because it often just feels like, here's a bunch of random swords, and it's like, roll a D100. Oh, it has bloody fingerprints on it. It's like, who cares?
Yeah.
It doesn't really meaningfully change the game experience.
Well, that's one of the things about DM's Guild and stuff in general. The fact that everyone can publish is really, really cool. But you also find that a lot of people, have good ideas sometimes, but they don't have the experience with the execution to really make it sing. So one of the things I always did with DM's Guild products is like, I really like the core of what this is here, and let me just rewrite this and tweak this into something that like I would actually play with. And it's only $1.99, so sure, why not? But they did that the DMs Guild Adept thing for a reason. When you find like the top 10 or 15 people that are really putting out a lot of quality content, you kind of raise them up. But I have to say, Wandering Traps sounds absolutely horrifying. So that would be really cool. And I've seen, one of the things Sersa said is I've seen some of the previews for some of the pages in the new book, and they're all killer. Like they definitely are. Like it doesn't feel like creating more stuff to create more stuff. It feels like everything you've sent me, I'm like, fuck, I could totally see exactly where I would plug this in.
Yeah, I see one of L2's comments in the chat, and there's definitely something to be said about the solo aspect of roll tables. I was telling Ryan recently that before the pandemic, a friend of mine and I would go out to this bar in town a lot on like a Friday night and bring our graph paper and just sit there for hours and drink and just roll up dungeons. Like it was so fun to just like bring a rule book and just come up with stuff. So that's always tough to balance as a designer. I actually don't think that designers should primarily design for that experience. Like I know there's a lot of people that are like, well, it's we put lore in our rule books because that's fun for people to read, and I don't think that should be the primary goal of a rule book. Like people kind of criticize the fourth edition books because they were manuals, and like yeah, that's what they should be. But yeah, it's fun to just kind of sit and have this solo activity to occupy your time.
Well, it's not even just a solo activity. I had a ton of fun on my stream when we were doing the dungeon, and a lot of people were hopping in and getting a roll on the table and seeing what would pop up and seeing how we were turning it into. And a lot of people were really digging that. I would not mind, sitting down and having, a stream every couple of weeks where it's just like, all right, stream is going to build a dungeon today, and I think a lot of people got a lot out of that. So, and I think a lot of people would get a lot out of playing something that's not 5e. I know a lot of people that have only played 5e, and I have not played nearly as many games as I would like to play, but that's the reason we have the weekly scroll, and that's the reason Thursdays, Jason kicked that off starting with Merkborg, but we're trying a bunch of new games and a bunch of new systems. And I feel like every time I learn a new system, more things about all the older systems make sense to me, if that makes sense at all. You know what I mean? Like I can understand this was not just a thing, this was a choice that was made, and this is a situation that come up where someone made a different choice, and I can understand why people do that across their systems. Like I've run into, I think like 5, 6, 7 different iterations of 2d6 at this point that are all completely different. And I did not realize how many different ways you can roll 2d6 and come up with a different system, whether it's roll over, roll under, or this the apocalypse style kind of like mixed success system. And there's a couple other ones that I've come across recently too, where it's like dice pools where you roll 2d6 or 3d6 if you have advantage, and you have to get a 5 or a 6 in order to succeed. There's so many different ways, and it's really interesting when you tweak a small mechanic like that, like just the 2d6. Like when you roll those two small dice, how does that incur like success or failure, and then all the rest of the game built on that base mechanic is super, super interesting to see. And I personally I absolutely love the mixed success system. I think for a lot of the reasons that you said, you really enjoyed it, because every roll has a consequence, and even when you partially succeed at the thing that you were trying to do, there's still a consequence for that as well. And you really only have, what is it, like it's like a 25% chance of absolute success, right?
Maybe. I forget how the bell curve works out, but
yeah, mathematics are stupid.
Yeah, and it starts like you start off pretty frail in Victory Basic. Like as you start to level up, things start to bend in your favor, of course. But again, that's by design. Like as you, which I really appreciated that you spelled that out very explicitly in both sessions. Like you are not super heroic, that there is a very high likelihood that you will be killed pretty unceremoniously. Well, it's also, I mean, the way that the original games are meant to be played, it's very much like playing a casino game or poker, and that it's really not about the individual hand, right? Like a character is like an individual poker hand. Really, you're playing across multiple hands. And so it's like if like your wizard dies, it's at lower levels, it's not that big of a deal. Really, what you want to be thinking of is at higher level, like as a dungeoneering party, how successful are we at delving the dungeon and increasing our war chest in terms of the treasure that we found and things like that. Because yeah, you're right. Like your odds of getting a straight up 10+ success are not great at first level.
No. And that makes it super, and that's what makes it super interesting for the DM too, is because on a success, cool, you cast your spell, good job. But literally from 1 to 9, you get to come up with something. And because it's not so rigidly defined by what happens, you get to make up a bunch of stuff as you go, and it can change based on how the battle is going, based on how the dungeoneers are making their way through the dungeon. It's not the same thing every single time. And one of the other things I really like about it, one of the things I kept saying to the players, a couple of things, was you can't really be against the players when you don't make any rolls. You know what I mean? So like, I like that, you know, in 5e, you're rolling for a monster. You decide what the monster does. You hit with the monster based on the stat blocks and everything like that. But with Victory Basic, it's like, well, you decided to hit the monster. So every consequence that comes from that is your choice. You decided to go in the room. You decided to hit the dragon. You made the roll that allowed the creature to hit you. And I really like the fact that all rolls have consequences and you rolled your own consequences, basically. You know what I mean? So the players
also eliminates. Sorry, go on.
No. What was that?
I said it also eliminates what I think is a very uninteresting way of playing D&D from my perspective, which is this kind of T1000 approach where the players enter a space. They don't really move or interact with it in a meaningful way. They just sort of scan it, and it's like Arcana roll, History roll, Religion roll. Like they just sort of just make these rolls, Perception roll, because there's no consequences to those rolls. And that's something that I've noticed. I've been playing the game since 2nd edition, and I've noticed this pretty much since 3rd, where when the game introduced these kinds of roles where you can learn about the world really without consequence, the engagement with the world changed. And so that's something that is very different in games like Victory Basic and very deliberate. And it goes back to something that you and I talked about a while ago, which is the way that a game's mechanics dictate player behavior. And it's something that I wish was kind of more widely appreciated in the tabletop RPG space. Because something as simple as you can technically roll for perception in Victory Basic. There is a search the room roll. But the fact that you can't just, I'm going to roll plus wisdom to look, it's like, well, if you roll a 9 or less, I get to make a move against you. Mm-hmm. That might mean you screwed up and brushed your hand against the wrong stone and triggered a trap, or you took up time and make a wandering monster roll. Like the fact that I think in that whole 3-hour session, I don't think a single person rolled that. Same with Spout Lore. I don't think a single person rolled Spout Lore. And that's, again, you didn't have to tell them that. That's the game's mechanics. It's what we talked about with like the way that a game, your scoring design is your game design. The things that your games reward and punish will dictate your players' behaviors to a substantial extent. And so it's like what you just talked about, like the ways that you can do different 2d6 systems, and just by tweaking different mechanics, that has a significant impact on how your players engage with the world. And for a game like Victory Basic, where I want it to feel tense, it needs to feel stressful, it needs to feel dangerous, but I also want players to engage with the world, not in like a pixel hunty type way, just like, no, just tell me what you're doing. Like, are you walking up to the chest? Are you looking at the face? Are you touching the gem and pulling it out? Because I really don't enjoy like players standing at the doorway and just doing like Terminator scanning the room and rolling all of their knowledge skills. I just don't find that very interesting. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And to speak directly to that on like the way the game is done, I when we were doing our zero session, I tried to push a lot. Like the game is deadly. Like you are not heroes. You are dungeoneers. You don't get better and become demigods. You kill monsters and take treasure, and then you can buy better equipment and get a little bit better at the things you're doing if you survive. But the odds of you surviving 3 sessions is low. I don't know. Anyone that watched knows how long that they took in that fountain room to literally just be like cautiously walking up and cautiously like looking things over and you know I didn't want they didn't want to roll for perception to check the room. But one of the things that you've talked about previously, especially in like Tomb of Mercy, if they look at this specifically, there's no reason to have them make a roll. Of course, they see it. If you decide to like flip through a desk, there's no reason to make a roll. But if you try to look at the desk from across the room, you know you're not going to see a bunch of stuff. So like when they were like, "Ooh, what do I see?" I'm like, "Well, you got to get a little bit closer to see the fountain if you want to." But you could see in their face going, "Fuck, shit." Oh man, if we get too close, what's going to happen? If we do this, is this going to do this? And then, you know, they looked over the fountain and stuff. And they even talked about it after in the debrief and even during the session where it's like, we don't know whether this is going to be really good or really bad. And with the consequences and the rewards being relatively equal, you can get either one. So if you choose not to investigate something, in how I feel like when I'm running Victory Basic, if they chose not to investigate that fountain, they're like, oh, we see a fountain from the other side, we're just going to cruise to the door. You don't know if you just missed out on a game-changing item or something that can absolutely help you. You know, they never even drank the water, you know, and I could have had that water be like some replenishing thing where they might have felt it, but they didn't have any hit points gone. But then once they got to that encounter two rooms later, they could have fled that encounter and actually drank from the fountain or something to regain some hit points. So I love what you just said about like everything feels tense. And that's one thing that the player specifically said to me too, is just like every time we walk in a room, whether it's mundane or it's covered with carrion crawlers, we don't know what to expect. We're always on edge. And that feels really, really cool to play a game where you pretty much have to be invested all the time in the things you're doing, or you're going to die, you know?
Yeah. And that risk and I mean, and stakes are an important part of engagement. I talk about this a bunch in my, I mean to pitch it, but my new online class
Oh no, yeah,
about choice
totally forgot to talk
design.
about that.
Um, you know, a really important part of making choices feel meaningful and making them feel engaging is stakes. Because if you were to just tell somebody about the adventure that you ran, it's like, well, they saw a fountain, they saw a treasure chest, and there was 2 carrion crawlers, and they fought some goblins, and then they found some gold. On paper, that doesn't sound terribly interesting, right? But in the moment, in the game, because the stakes were so high for those characters, that created a tremendous amount of engagement because it was so dangerous. And then ideally, and I think this happened in the game, um, because resources are so scarce, especially at lower levels, that the players are encouraged to then use desperate strategies. And I think for me, the highlight of the session last week was when Hunter used Mage Hand to activate the dragon idol to use its breath weapon, because that is exactly what you need to be doing. Because I think a lot of players will look and see like, well, I don't have any explicitly offensive spells, and that is the wrong way to think about things in OD&D. Like, you need to be looking at your sheet and you need to be thinking beyond your sheet and go, what can I do to contribute to this situation? Because you're often not going to have the perfect tool. You're going to have, and I think I don't know, the Principia Apocrypha, that weird document, I think I'm pronouncing it right, explicitly says like, you're going to have to think outside the box here, and find a way to contribute. And when he came up with that and was like, oh wait, I have Mage Hand, I can manipulate this idol, pull the lever, and get it to maybe breathe on its own, breathe on the kobolds. And then the fact that he rolled the mixed success, and I think you adjudicated it perfectly. It's exactly what I would have done, which is it moves the wrong way. Yeah, it burns alive two of the kobolds, but it also burns two of your friends. That for me, that's the essence of dungeoneering right there. I think you made a perfect ruling, and that's again that's what it's all about. And I think if you didn't have those high stakes, I don't think players feel as incentivized to look to those desperate situations. And
Yeah,
that's from the game design perspective, that's ideally what you want to happen.
yeah, that was such a fun part of it too. What's interesting about that entire dragon encounter is we set up a bunch of that stuff, and then I completely forgot. For those that haven't watched it, I used Roll20, and I did dynamic lighting. But most of the dungeon is not lit, so the kobolds and dragons are able to see, in the dark and are fighting each other, and then suddenly the players walk in with this torch. But what I also didn't realize is the torch wasn't from the GM side of it, actually building it. They couldn't even see the dragon relic that I wanted to describe to them what they were fighting over. So I had to be like, oh, it's just a relic. It can't do a real breath weapon, so they have to turn it on somehow. So I had the kobold actually like light a torch and stick it inside so that I could put a light on the map so the players could actually see what was happening. And then the whole like lever action came from, well, if he sticks a torch in there, it creates this kind of like mechanical situation, and they're trapsmiths, so there has to be some way that he turns it on, right? Because before it was just gonna be like, player walks on maybe like a pressure plate and it just blows flame or something like that. But because I forgot to light it up and have the kobold stick that in, it kind of triggered that let's have a lever situation, which allowed Hunter to be like, oh, I can pull this lever and try to make this happen. So it was a really, really fun way it all fell out. And yeah, I think for me, that was the highlight of the thing too. That felt, as you just said, like the mechanics working perfectly. Like this is exactly what a mixed success should feel like, is yes, you succeeded at what you wanted to do, but you hurt your allies, but you also did hurt some of the bad guys too. I'll take it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And to L2's point in the chat, like there's a really great book, Jeff Warrender, called "You Said This Would Be Fun," and there's a phrase he uses in it, that I think I said earlier, that your scoring design is your game design. What that really means is just that, the things that your game system incentivizes and rewards mechanically are the things that your players are going to do. And so, to your point, yeah, I think when players don't see the utility in non-aggressive spells, when the players aren't doing a behavior that you want them to do, from a game design perspective, like if I was designing a game and I was like, okay, well, we have these utility spells, and in playtest, I'm not seeing the players actually using them. The question I would ask myself is, okay, is the game system adequately incentivizing them mechanically? Because it's also not enough to just tell the players to do that. Because the way that players operate at the table is that you can't just tell them, hey, don't forget to use these utility spells. The game has to mechanically incentivize those things, and one of the ways that you do that is through danger. Because I think Hunter was basically like bleeding out and was like, I have nothing left, I'm going to die. Didn't he just escape from the firewall? Like he was basically scraping the bottom of the barrel.
He was toast. Yeah, and as you said earlier, mages at low levels are like mages are always glass cannons. They're very squishy. Victory basic mages are very squishy. They can't wear armor. So I think Ginger the fighter has almost as much armor as Hunter our mage has health, like entirely. So
yeah, and so that's one of the things that I'm painting with a really broad brush here in terms of 5e, but maybe I'll defer to Ryan on this, but I don't really know to what extent a game like 5th edition, as it's actually played at the table by most groups, actually mechanically incentivizes the use of utility spells in that sort of way. Like I think a lot of characters can just get by without really needing to have to think about like, oh, do I really need to use Mage Hand in this unique way, or am I already pretty well stacked with my
Yeah, no,
normal
they it
powers? You
it
know?
doesn't. And what L2 had said in chat was he said, yeah, that's sort of the thing. I always get a bit disappointed when D&D players don't see utility in non-aggressive spells. I love how this system encourages you to think about utility creatively. It doesn't. In 5th edition, um, they will encourage. They don't encourage really anything, but they definitely don't incentivize using non-combat spells in combat because the way 5e is written. It does not encourage players to run away if they're punching above their weight because 5e is really about balance and like the encounter should be balanced to fit the players, so they should be able to defeat it, and most players feel that way, where it's just like if we just keep hacking away, our DM's not going to kill us, we'll kill this thing. But if I take a turn to do something non-combat, I feel like I'm making a mistake. I feel like I have to
Yeah.
do this combat thing to chip away at something. Even going over to like cast a healing spell on somebody. It's crazy the number of times a cleric will get up in the fray and will burn all their spells and then just have healing at the end versus like doing what a cleric should do for the most part is be a support class, and sit back and use their heals more strategically to keep the harder hitting players up in important moments, as opposed to using them almost as like a last resort a lot of times. Um,
Yeah.
so at least that's my experience with running 5e as much as I've ran it, is especially in combat. 5e basically tells you just keep hacking away, and anytime you don't do damage, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And Andy said 5e incentivizes combat by being clear about combat rules and being unclear about everything else. I completely agree. I think 5e is kind of like we put all of this stuff out there, and filled it up with this stuff and have bloated it out. But then they do this caveat at the end, this little thing that says, "But play it how you want to play it," and it's like that's not helpful. You over explain and make things too specific on a lot of things, and then under explain and are not specific enough about a lot of other things. So you don't really, I can't really say I want to do this because guess what? You don't have rules for this. But when all your other rules are so super specific, like I'm just going to sit and try to find the specific rules for this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So one of the previous comments that Andy made that I think that I missed that I wanted to bring up before was he said, I feel like DMing 5e is more performative and GMing OSR and older editions is more playing a game along with the group. And I feel that very, very hard, especially going from our Dark Kingdoms game on Wednesdays to Victory Basic on Thursdays. The kind of like dichotomy couldn't be more, I guess, going from 5e one day to Victory Basic the next day, in especially going from like 5 or 6 players to 3 players, and just seeing the different ways that people interact with each other and with the game and within the party, and within the world around you, versus going into Victory Basic where it just feels much more. I don't even know how to describe it specifically. In the moment, like present, intense, tense. You know what I mean? I feel like
Yeah.
one of the things I loved the most was, like I said this already, was the fountain room where the players took forever to realize, as far as they know, it's just a mundane fountain. But they don't know whether they're going to get killed or have a life changing event happen. So they take their time with it. And I really, really, really loved that. Um, that every part of what they wanted to do and all the decisions that they tried to make were very like thought out. Like they really sat down and were like, okay, what do we want to do with this? This is what we see. This is what's happening. It's not like, fountain, perception check, nothing, move on, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Well, one of the things about Victory Basic, at no point in any of the books is the term role playing game used. Um, it is very explicitly a fantastic medieval war game, and Uh, the same is true of OD&D. I mean, you literally had to own the Chainmail War game to play it. And again, that's one of those things where it's kind of hard to realize because it's such a different cultural context than the one we have now for gaming. But D&D was a war game, and despite the culture that surrounds the game now and the way the game is talked about in the trade dress, the rules are largely intact from that era. Especially when you compare it to other games. There's a great phrase that somebody used where each edition sort of simplifies in some areas and recomplicates in some areas and shuffles and moves things around and changes things and keeps other things the same so that the game is at once totally different but also exactly the same as it always has been, right? But to the point that Andy made, like, that's exactly right, because when you were playing Victory Basic, you were not playing a role-playing game. The way that we think about it, you are basically playing a war game. You are playing something that is more similar to Warhammer or Hero Quest or Descent than you are playing something like what we would think of as a role-playing game or a storytelling game, which is one of the reasons why I was extremely worried. I'll be honest about it on the stream here. Was really worried that no one would like it when you ran it.
Really?
Because I mean, I'm looking at your stream right now about the Adventure Archive. They are an RP heavy group of adventurers, and
That's
Victory
true.
Basic does not fit into that milieu. Victory Basic, it is a procedural dungeon delving board game. You know what I mean? And the fact that people enjoyed it was a tremendous surprise. And I'm glad. I'm very happy people enjoyed it. But that was not my expectation. Because it's basically like one step above watching people play Hero Quest on stream. And so,
Well,
yeah,
I think part of it is the group that we have is just clicked right away. All of those guys are fucking hysterical, and I'm really glad that they dug into it. And I know Moses Moose is. It's also an interesting mix of people too. Ginger does not have very much experience with D&D. I think he played like one campaign of 5e. So he's not, he's not like me or some of the other party members who have been doing like RP heavy with filters and voices for 5 years. You know what I mean? And then you have Moses, who's a really experienced D&D player, and then you have Hunter, who's just extremely similar to me in that we've done a lot of 5e, but we talk about so many other games. I mean, it's one of the reasons he's on our podcast with me, is he's dug through so many other games. He's played a bunch of other games. We've always talked about doing like world building and like game design stuff and looking at different things together. So he's kind of, in the same boat I am with 5e, where it's just like looking for other things. So we have someone who doesn't have a ton of experience with 5e, someone who's got a lot of experience with 5e and some other games, and then myself and another player who are digging deep into a bunch of various different games. So you got like the plethora of, using 5e as kind of like the current kind of I describe it as like a giant spire. It is the this like over kind of like overwhelming monument that fills the space but casts this like long shadow that all of these other games are now being able to like grow up in. And without that, that shadow, at least in the current iteration of role-playing games, they wouldn't have that space in order to blossom. But it's really interesting to have a wide variety of mix of the party, but still have a great personality amongst the group. But in addition, I think that they all just really embraced the system as a system. And I told them, like, you don't really need to pick names. If you want to pick a name, you can, but it's pretty much just going to be jokey. And that's exactly what they did. They're like, my name is like, I don't even remember what Moses said his name was, but not RPing, playing the game. And I think it was also really fun to see a lot of the people that watched us build the dungeon on my stream get to see it played out on in game on the Adventure Archive, because I remember the same kind of thing happened when we were doing the kind of like dungeon crawl in the Southlands on Dark Kingdoms, where you had created that one shot for my home world that we then adapted into the final boss fight. And a lot of people were in my stream while we were adapting that, and seeing the ways that there were traps that could happen in it. That there was the acid pools for the embalming acid, and then the different ways that the creatures and stuff could work, and the different ways the whole bottom level worked out. Like when we had the players cutting off their own body parts and stuff like that. They really like to see, I guess, like how the sausage was made, and then get to actually go see how the game was played. So I think a lot of people really embrace that aspect of the game. And also a lot of people know you at this point. I talk about Sersa Victory so much on all our streams, and talk about the ways that you helped me with creating the dungeon, or like I said, the way that we did the Southlands dungeon. And I think a lot of people were like, oh, we actually get to play a game fully written by Sersa. That's another aspect that brought people into it too. So I think there's a lot of different reasons that people were really invested. But I think even if it wasn't specifically to see like a quote unquote like war game being played, once they saw it being played, they're like, oh, this is really cool. This is really different. This is a whole different vibe than what we're used to, and it's really neat. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm very happy with how the session went, and optimistic that may mean that we can do more than 3.
yeah, no, I we've already talked to the players, and I said that so the way our Thursday stream works a lot is basically Jason is our non D&D DM, but he can't, you can't prep a multi-session adventure in 1 week between arcs of different games. So all of the interim space between when Jason is going to be running like Mothership or Merkborg or a different game, I said that I could fill in that space, and I already dropped a message into the planning channel, where I was like, hey, I think maybe this is probably going to be more than 3 sessions. It would be great if we could actually do like level 2 of the dungeon, level 3 of the dungeon in between other games. L2 just made a really cool point. He said, I think in its own way, wargaming lets you play out role-playing yourself as a person. Like you are Indiana Jones, whereas in D&D, it encourages you to play Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones because you're not an archaeologist. And I totally get that point. Like you don't. I remember when we played your I think it was called Tower of Gygax, but whatever it is that you're going to call it in the future, where we just had 3 people come on and we played out this adventure, and it was just like we did with Victory Basic. It's Moses is the cleric, Ginger is the fighter. As a player in that, it would be it's kind of cool to take a step away from that. Like, all right, I have a character, the point of 5e is to create a character, then play in the world as that character. I don't have to play in Victory Basic as that character. I get to play it as me. Like, I get to make my decisions the way I would make my decisions. I get to recognize the clues I would make. I would recognize in those situations, not my 8 intelligence barbarian would get to make. So it's neat to be able to play it from your own perspective versus playing it as a character from their perspective. And for me, it feels like a really awesome change of pace, to be able to do that, even as the GM, but getting to see players do that. So it's like, it's not Ginger creating a fighter that's going through the dungeon. It's Ginger as a fighter going through the dungeon, which is a really neat kind of like subtle nuance to it, but still like super fun to see, to GM, and maybe one day play, or at least it was fun when I get to play it in the similar system and you ran it for me. So I definitely think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and that can be a little bit of a culture shock for some people. I did notice once or twice in the session, I can't remember who it was, but a player deliberately signposting that they were metagaming. And I remember jumping into chat and being like, you don't have to do that. Like, metagaming as a concept doesn't exist in this game. There is no separation conceptually between you and your character. Like, any knowledge that you have not only can you bring it to bear, but you need to if you intend to survive. And again, when you've only really played games where there's this pretty hard separation, like my buddy Joe, who's been in chat and he's helped me with a bunch of games. I actually introduced you to me, or me to you.
Yeah, Milwaukee Joe. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he's more plugged into the 5e world, and I guess like kind of the reigning. It's called like actor mode or actor mindset, Sigma grind set, something like that, where I guess it's like the whole thing is like anything that would be outside of the character's five senses is verboten, which to me is just completely. I just can't wrap my head around that. So if somebody's coming from a game like that where you're just totally immersed in this fictional persona, to then come from that to a game where it's like, no, just do whatever you want. If you as a player know it, then your character knows it. Then rock out.
Yeah.
What else?
Yeah, and I
there
mean,
it is. Sersa said it.
oh yeah, because he said it encourages role players. It encourages what role players call metagaming, but in this game, literally letting you think without the filter of potential character thought. So literally, like as he was writing that, you were saying like, oh yeah, metagaming is totally no such thing. That's just the game.
Yeah.
Yeah. So and I really like that because I mean, you know, 5e has its place, and I do really like to fully immerse. And I feel like I ask this question to you a lot when I'm planning stuff like that. Even within Victory Basic, where it's like, would the players know this? Like, would the players know this? Because in 5e, it's like, you know, you even in Roll20, or like Beyond 20, there are ways to hide the role of the monster so that you don't give away the monster's name, because the players, if they've never seen it before, wouldn't even know the monster's name, much less its stats or its health or anything like that. And it's this whole thing where it's like, you know, even when Andy would do things like post the monster's AC visible, there's people who would be like, oh, you let them know what the AC is? Like, how dare you? Like, you know, you have to be fully immersed. They don't know. They just, you know, they hit or not. And if they figure it out eventually, cool, but keep it to yourself. So there is something to be said for being able to play a game where you can, you know, completely and fully immerse into the system, and it's got its place and it can be fun, but at the same time, you know, as a player especially, there's always that part of you where it's like, shit, I know this, but my character doesn't know this, so how do I play this out? You know, and it's hard, and some people find that hard to be able to separate that information. But being able to play Victory Basic, where you literally are just like, you're playing you and what you know your character knows, it's very freeing for people that have only played 5e, where you do that fully immersive thing. So I mean, there's spaces for both. But you know, as I said, I'm pretty over 5e, and I'm definitely more into, and specifically because of you, into the game design aspect of things, and the game aspect of things. And I like to not have to try to hide information from a character that the player clearly already knows. It feels like this unnecessary barrier to play, where yeah, it just feels unnecessary sometimes, and especially in this system, it's really freeing, I think, to be able to just be like, I know all the things that I know. So
yeah. Well, one of the things I haven't really thought this through a whole lot yet, but like I actually am not convinced that a player knowing details of the game world in a mechanical way is actually something that diminishes immersion. I'll give you an example. There was somebody who wrote a blog post about Mailed Fist a couple weeks ago. I didn't read all of it because I don't usually read reviews of my own work or read what people write about me. But I did catch a snippet because Joe shared it with me. And he described my work as being like, you know, he favors like competition, tournament stuff over immersion. And I kind of took issue with that framing because one of the things that people tell me a lot is that they feel like when they play my adventures, they're very flavorful and very immersive. They're like, well, I have a really vivid sense of where I am. And they're very evocative for me, and I have a very clear sense of place. And I think a lot of people take for granted that, like, oh well, I know the monster's armor class and that takes me out of the sense of immersion, but I actually don't know if that's true. And I don't necessarily know that, or I don't necessarily think that it's true that you have to just completely shut out, like pretend that you're not playing a game to be immersed. And I think that as game designers, you can actually create game systems that encourage immersion, because I think that leads to this weird like cultural militarism people have in the D&D world, where you can never have out of character knowledge, that you have to be in that actor mindset, that you can never describe anything that the character's senses couldn't discern. That role playing is something that is completely outside of the purview of rules, which is totally false. Ludite Sam has a great write up about this on her blog. I think that, like, I don't know. I haven't really, like I said, I really haven't really thought this through yet, but I I feel like the things that take people out of the immersion when it comes to role playing games may not be the things that they think take them out of immersion. I think they think that, oh, I know the monster's armor class, or you know I know that I have a healing spell I can cast twice per day and that takes me out of the moment. I don't know if that's true, but yeah.
Yeah, I think part of it is what you said, where the mechanics of the game can um, influences how players play the game, and the way the game is written and stuff like that. And I do feel that 5e encourages people to really separate those things, to have a difference between character knowledge and player knowledge. And to encourage the way that works, right? So I think if people are really invested in that difference, you kind of have to look at where that comes from, I think. And if fifth edition encourages that style of play, people that have only played fifth edition, and people that learn those rules, and especially people that are quote unquote like rules lawyers, will really take those rules to heart. And especially, I don't know if it's always been this way, and I hate people that are like, it's worse than it's ever been. Every generation said that about everything, but I think people are very people like to put themselves in a box nowadays, if that makes sense. Like, I have to take a stand on this because this defines me. So when you have someone who is super into fifth edition rules, and then part of the rules is, immersive, it's role playing focused. There's a difference between character knowledge and player knowledge. People draw these really hard lines, and really want to stand firm on that because they feel like their perspective creates their personality, I guess. When in fact it's if anything, if there's a line at all, it's a very fuzzy, very broad line. So I don't know if and again, just spitballing, kind of like you said, I haven't really thought this completely through. But if there's people that want to take a hard stance because that's how they play, and a lot of people only know the way they've played and only play the games that they've played. And when someone challenges that, they feel like they're being challenged, or what it is. But I as a DM, I did that for a long time, and I really enjoyed it too. And I'm not saying I don't now necessarily. Like I said, everything has its place. But I think there is something to be said for trying to create a situation, if this is the kind of game you want to play, where you are your character. And I do find that fun sometimes. And I used to find it more fun, I guess. And now I'm moving a lot more towards a game like Victory Basic. I think, like, for me personally, I think I'm running this game at the perfect time in my tabletop career, where we're already like 7-8 weeks into the podcast, exploring different games, and then a lot of those games we've explored have been like 2d6 style systems, and then actually being able to sit down and not only play the system, but I think I said this on stream too, being able to have the person who literally created the system in your chat, helping you and guiding you the entire way, is incredibly beneficial to being able to run the game well.
Yeah.
Jason and Andy have been saying stuff in the chat. Jason said, "I know Hankrin Fernale at Runehammer uses the visible DC for a room that all the players see, so they know what a success or failure means. And I think there's a lot of tension in knowing what you have to roll since you know the probability, which is exactly how the 2d6 systems work really, really well. There are no there's no DC you have to guess. There's no DC that the GM has to make up. You know, 1 to 9, or at least 1 to 6 you fail. 7 to 9 make success. We'll see what happens, and then 10 plus you succeed. I really enjoy knowing exactly what that is. I think I haven't run it, but I know that we want to go over it on Weekly Scroll sometime, or at least I very much want to go over. Is Shadow the Demon Lord? I think
Yeah.
it's Raw. Is it Robert Schwab? He helped build the 5e rules, and then as far as I have read, basically said these feel a little too complicated. Let's make something like a lot of people call 5e rules light, which it's very not. He wanted to make a more rules light version of the 5e rules medium system, and in his system, all the DCs are 10, and there's like pluses and minuses to rolls and things like that. There's like modifiers and banes and all sorts of stuff that come from it. But at the end of the day, if your math adds up to greater than 10, you succeed. And I do think this kind of like rolling DCs in 5e, in my opinion, is one of the worst mechanics, because it's so, I guess, subjective. Like what you might call a DC 15, I might call a DC 13, and the player might call it a DC 15, but you call it a DC 18. And there's this sense of just like, I don't know what's happening, which I think takes people out of the tension, as opposed to putting the tension in, which I think the intention of, those DCs is to kind of create tension. But when you don't know, when a roll happens and you're like, what's going to happen? I feel like you create a lot more tension knowing what you have to get and then rolling than rolling and being like, okay, now what?
Yeah. I mean, to your point and Jason's point, that's something that I hit on very explicitly in my course, which is it's a common mistake that people make where they think that by withholding information that increases tension, but in fact the opposite is true. That you don't have to give away everything, but the player, or in the case of game books, the reader, needs to understand what the stakes are, and what the trade-offs are for the choice they're making or the role they're about to make, because that's where the tension of the choice or the role, that's where it lives, that's where it is. If the player is just making a choice or making a role, doesn't know what's at stake, doesn't know what the risks are or what the likely consequences of her action are, there is no tension or drama, which is why a lot of games, and unfortunately a lot of game books, don't actually feel that engaging. So, and then to one of your earlier points about like game systems, I don't actually talk about game design outside of stuff like this, because in general, it's not. I don't think it's very useful to just talk to random people and be like, 5e is not a very well designed game. That's just not very useful to just like the gamer off the street.
Right.
I think designer to designer, it's helpful because you can learn from those conversations the same way in any sort of creative field. Like if you're talking about art or music, it's like, hey, we can have a critical conversation about a piece of art so that we can apply it to our own work. And I think the takeaway with games like 5th edition is just identify what you're trying to accomplish. Like if you want to be a game where you want to immerse the players, them opportunities to develop a character and take them through a heroic journey that resembles something that you would see in like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones or Critical Role, then your responsibility as a designer is not to wave your hands and say, this is what our game is about. But by the way, here's a bunch of saver dies and equipment lists. It's no, again, our scoring design is our game design. What rules can we create to mechanically incentivize that behavior? And to borrow from this book, Rules of Play: Game Design Fundamentals by Salin and Zimmerman, they say that the game needs to present the players with interesting choices within a game system that provides for meaningful kinds of choice making, right? So the choices that you present the players, if the game is about telling an interesting story, your choices shouldn't be what kind of sword do I swing and how hard do I swing it. It should be something like bonds, like what is my relationship to the person across the table, and how does that bond play out in the story? I'm saying, that's like so in Ludite Sam's series, Chasing the Dragon, they talk about backgrounds in fifth edition. And people say, well, background, oh, this is great. They're bringing role playing, they're bringing story to D&D. And, they write, well, do they really? Because let's take a look at things like strength. Like if you take the strength ability score out of the game, the whole game falls apart. You cannot play D&D without strength.
Right.
Backgrounds are optional. You can take backgrounds that the game proceeds as normal. And that just shows you what the game characterizes as important. If you want to, and again, I wouldn't say this to somebody who was just talking about like, oh, I like to play 5th edition. Fine, knock yourself out. I don't care. But for people like you and I, we're kind of in this context of having a talk about game design. I would say, okay, we're two game designers, we're two artists having a conversation here. If you want to go forth and make your own game where you want to emphasize things like role playing and storytelling, and you want to learn from 5th edition, that's what you should take away is, okay, maybe I should have less emphasis on having the players choose the ways in which they hurt others and avoid being hurt themselves, and more, what are my relationships? And, if Jason's still in the chat, I'm sure he has a ton of insights into this. Like, what are the structures of stories? And, a lot of story games do this, and this is something that I encourage a lot of people to do who may not have played a lot of games other than D&D. Go look at games that are about creating stories. This is something, again, that I think Ludite Sam talks about in their blog, that a lot of people who think, well, role-playing is something that's beyond the domain of rules, oftentimes those people have not really played things beyond D&D or D&D-like games. And so they don't really have a lot of experience with a game that is designed for telling stories. And when they see them, like, oh wow, this is incredible, And when you see games designed by people who know what the structure of stories are like, you can then design rules to push, whether it's like, the traditional Campbellian hero's journey, or I don't know how many points, the 7-point plot structure, or however many points we're up to, or the Lester Dent plot formula, or these kinds of things. You can create really interesting games that, the very mechanics create interesting stories and focus less on I swing my sword and deal 1d8 damage. Because I think you mentioned this earlier. You were talking about like being very present and in the moment. And that same blog series, Chasing the Dragon, talks about how war games and story games, and I'm going to get kind of academic here, I'm really sorry, they operate on different levels of abstraction. And so games like D&D are very simulationist, and they operate on a very low level of abstraction, in that they model very like moment by moment, blow by blow gameplay, where it's like, okay, I swing my sword, I roll to determine the effect of swinging my sword, and then I resolve that action, right? And then the gameplay is just a series of those very low level, in the moment kinds of things that are happening. Whereas a lot of story games are kind of one level up in terms of abstraction, where they sort of resolve the overall outcome of the scene, where it's like, I'm a character, I'm trying to negotiate with another character in a scene. We've determined that the outcome of the scene is that I successfully negotiate. And then we work backwards from there to tell the story of what happened. We're not necessarily resolving each individual syllable that I speak from my mouth, We're telling a lot of story games, they're operating at a very high level, like Fiasco does this, where you're kind of breaking the game up into scenes, and each player takes a turn kind of describing the scene. I think I keep wanting to call it 16 Candles. That's the movie. 10 Candles is kind of like
10
that,
Candles, yeah.
where you're not like adjudicating every single step or move. You're kind of
Right.
again, you have this higher level story structure. I keep thinking of Thompson Twins.
Yeah.
Um,
No, and we did 10 candles here on the stream for Halloween too. So
yeah, and so I'm not articulating it very well, but it's it's one of those things that it's very academic, but that's a really important thing to understand is that when you want to tell a story and create a game that encourages the telling of stories, it's difficult to do that at that very low level of abstraction where you're focusing on these like blow by blow moments. Like story games really need to happen at that higher level of abstraction where you're
yeah.
working at the level of scenes and story beats as opposed to like I move here, I swing my sword, I cast my spell, I do this thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and that's exactly where I am now. I think one of the and I know we're kind of not necessarily bashing on 5e a lot, which I do frequently now. It's 5e has its place, and there's a reason that 5e for a lot of people is kind of the gateway drug into tabletop role playing game, right? It's because it's got a little bit of everything, kind of, but it's just a little bit of everything. And when you haven't played any games, having a little bit of everything is a great way to be introduced to tabletop role playing game. You get some combat, you get some RP, you get some rules, you get some character creation, you get a little bit of character development, you get a bunch of stuff. But at some point, what people need to do is realize that 5e is kind of a jack of all trades and a master of none. And I know a lot of people don't understand that entire quote, but I'm using the intention of the small quote, which is jack of all trades, master of none, in that it's got a little bit of everything, but isn't great at anything. But if you want to play, like you just said, like a storytelling game, if you're like, I love the RP is my favorite, 5e is not the game for you. Play Archipelago, or play Microscope, or play 10 Candles, or grab a game from like Adam Vass or Chris Bissett and do like The Wretched, or something like that. Things that are literally designed to just be story-based games. Or if you really like the combat, move into things that are more like war gamey, like play a game similar to like Victory Basic or some of the other 2d6 systems where the mechanics are a lot more prevalent and important in the game design and then the character development and things like that. So I think 5e, whether intentionally or not, I mean, on top of the fact that they're a game, they're also owned by a mega corporation. I mean, they're owned by WotC, who's owned by Hasbro. So, a lot of the choices that they make, you can pretty much tell aren't necessarily theirs. Like, I don't blame people like Chris Perkins or something for just fucking ramming Magic the Gathering into 5th edition D&D. I blame Hasbro and I blame WotC, because it was all a money-making thing. So you have to really look back at that. And another reason to pick kind of smaller indie games is to not have that. People can create a game with the intention that they want in the game. But they try to be this kind of like, they put themselves out as like, oh, you want to play space horror? Play it in 5e. Oh, you want to play... what else do I have? You want to play the medieval? That's our base setting. You want to play this? You want to play that? You can easily play it in 5e. And it's like, yeah, you can. But if you want to play space horror, why not play like Alien or Mothership, which is actually designed as a space horror game? If you want to play just literally anything you want to play, somebody out there probably made a game designed specifically to play that, not just a game system that you can shoehorn the things you want into it. So again, not bashing on 5e for what 5e currently is. I think it is a fantastic gateway into tabletop role-playing game. It was my gateway into tabletop role-playing games. A lot of the people I know, it was their gateway into tabletop role-playing games, but a lot of those same people have now moved away from it into the games, like I said, that they really want to play. The games that are designed to play those things, as opposed to just kind of like this kind of mix mash, little bit of everything game that 5e kind of is right now. So
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is I am pretty indifferent to what individual people like to play, and I have a very when in Rome approach personally. Like if somebody was like, "Hey, I want to run a 5e game, you want to play?" I'm not going to be like, don't you know that 5e is a badly designed game? I'm like, cool, yeah, I just like spending time with people.
Yeah.
When I discuss game design stuff, it's always in a very academic kind of context. Although I will say, I do think that a lot of people can conflate D&D as an easy on-ramp with D&D is a widely available game that's heavily marketed by a major gaming corporation. And my feeling is if historical circumstances were slightly different, we would be sitting here talking about Tunnels and Trolls right now, regardless of what the actual rule system. We'd be sitting here talking about how great Tunnels and Trolls is at telling stories. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I don't
it's
disagree
just
with
the
that at
fact that
all.
I
No.
can walk into Target and buy Dungeons and Dragons. I think is really more of what we're kind of describing here. And also, I just recently I volunteer at a library. I just sat down with the teen and children's librarians not too long ago to talk about this kind of subject. And the unanimous feeling was that D&D 5th edition is an incredibly difficult game to teach to children and teenagers and families, to the point where everyone is either using different systems or having to do a lot of legwork to bring D&D down to a level where people who don't have experience with role-playing games can understand what's happening.
Mhm.
And so I think, again, when you have familiarity with role-playing games, it can be easy to forget just how challenging it is to actually teach it, or become blind to actually how much you have to carve away from the game or obscure from people to make it intelligible. Again, I don't really. If people are like, well, I've taught a lot of people, that's fine. But again, if you and I are having kind of an academic conversation about the game, I would encourage people to just, like you said, think about what it is that you want out of the games that you play. And if you're designing your own games, think about, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? What player behaviors am I trying to encourage? And maybe I can look at systems beyond D&D and its, sisters like Pathfinder or 13th Age or whatever, and get a sense of what else is actually out there. Because there's just so much to learn, especially from story games and independent games and things like that. And also being able to push past a lot of the meaningless terms. Like, I haven't used the term OSR all night, and that's on purpose, because I feel like that's one of those terms that has become so diluted as to be meaningless. Because I think a lot of people just use OSR as a shorthand for rules light, which is not true.
Yeah, 100%.
Same by
I
Powered
completely
by
agree
the
with that. Yeah.
Apocalypse, where people are just like, well, it's a 2d6 system, so it must be Powered by the Apocalypse. And that's, again, I think for most conversations, it's accurate enough. But again, I wouldn't correct somebody if we were just having a casual conversation, because that's just a really just weird and obnoxious thing to do.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
um,
But
I don't know
I
where I was
completely
going.
agree
I
with
had
you.
a
I think a
point,
lot
but I
of
forgot it.
people, no, a lot of people do just say like basically like anything rules light in current tabletop gaming is OSR. But I posted this link earlier, and I very much encourage. Sersa sent this to me, and it was incredibly helpful for me as a DM and as a player and as a game designer working on a system for what like OSR actually is. I think there's a quote very early on. Is it Ben Milton that does the early quote? The guy that wrote Knave. I think he talks about specifically like these are the things you want in your OSR game, not just like your rules light game. And in a very brief way, it's not necessarily rules light. It is an unbalanced world where the combat is not balanced. I'm not even going to pretend to read the quote. I'll just have to actually look it up because I know I'm going to fuck it up and make it up. But like you just said, OSR does not necessarily mean just rules light. It's a very specific style that I completely agree has become diluted to basically anything rules light. Anything with lighter rules in 5th edition is now called quote unquote OSR, when there's actually 4 or 5 or 6 things that really specifically make OSR style games. So Knave 2nd edition is coming out soon. I just bought Knave 1st edition. God damn it.
Yeah.
But
And with a lot of that stuff, it's helpful to go back to the origins of the term. Like with with OSR, like It emerged at a time before PDFs were widely available for most role-playing games, and retro clones weren't really a thing. You couldn't just like hop on drive-through and get a copy of AD&D or something like that. And so we're like, okay, well, I want to be able to play and produce new material for games like OD&D and Basic and Advanced D&D. What are our options here? And that's when you had the first retro clones, which emerged that were using the third edition open game license. And I think the first ones were like Castles and Crusades and Osric, the old school reference index compilation. I think those were the original ones that were third edition. They basically just, used the OGL to create things that approximated, the original games. And that's really what the OSR was. And then you kind of flash forward to now. And I might be controversial here, but like games like Merkborg, which for me I think are nominally OSR, but in my mind, like I don't consider them OSR in any meaningful way, other than they're rules light and make overtures to like I think they use BX, Basic Expert, as kind of but I don't think in terms of actual gameplay they bear much resemblance to something like basic D&D. So
Yeah, I don't know. I know a lot of people call Merkborg. Oh, I was going to say I know a lot of people call Merkborg OSR, but I'm really curious if they actually ever call themselves OSR.
yeah, it might
And
be a
then,
situation where the audience is really at fault here. It's the fans who are
but
wrong.
then I click on their website, and underneath there's a section that on the Merkborg website that says Merkborg is a complete game in the OSR genre. So they do in fact call themselves OSR. Um, but it it depends, I guess, on just like everything else, and just like things we talked about, like people's definition of things, and people what they want to call. I at least from what I know, like I feel like you are definitely like a scholarly source for game design information, if that makes sense. And I'm curious how many of these people that are making games, even games like Mark Borg, the Designers and stuff like that, are as well read on the history of games and game design and stuff as you are. So it becomes this kind of like you just said, where it's not like you'd go up to someone to play Mercury and be like, that's not really OSR, right? Um, but
Just be obnoxious.
yeah, and there's no reason.
Yeah,
There's
it's
no
not a
reason
value
for it,
judgment. I mean,
no.
it's just one of those things where, yeah, if I had to guess, I would say, that the developers of that game are probably big fans of old school games and played them quite a bit. I think just the language, language changes and evolves, and it's like with roguelikes. Like there's a big, you know, debate in the roguelike world on like what counts as a roguelike and what's a roguelite. And in my mind, genres are marketing terms. Like I don't think art inherently has a genre, and I think creators should just create what they want and then later give it a genre so you can market it to the right people. And so for me, when it comes to stuff like OSR or roguelike, for me, I'm not like trying to be a purist. It's just I want to make sure that when I buy something, like when I'm buying an OSR product, it's like, is this going to be something that will fit in with, something that is OD&D in nature? Like it's a dungeon, the logistical dungeon crawling game. Same with the roguelikes. Like if I'm going to buy a roguelike game, is it going to be an ASCII or very minimalist graphic procedurally generated game, and not like there was one that was a roguelike game that I saw at a convention, but it was like Bubble Bobble. I'm like, what the fuck is this? It was a cool game, but it's like if I wouldn't have known that that's what it was. So again, not a value judgment on those games. Everything I mentioned was super fun, but it's more of a marketing and branding thing than anything.
Right. Well, that's funny because Jason said the exact same
Yeah.
thing as you were saying. That I feel like most people use it as a marketing term anymore, which is completely true. I mean, because a lot of art, art becomes commodity and becomes, you have to be able to advertise it and parse it and stick it in a box so people can understand it for their perspective. Which, it is what it is. Andy asked, "Have you ever had a chat with Jeremy Crawford?" Jeremy Crawford, if I remember correctly, is the person who judged the dungeon contest where you were named the was it the Apprentice of a Sarah Rack previously?
That was Chris Perkins. I've
Oh,
interacted with.
Perkins. Yeah.
I don't know if I've talked to Jeremy. Um, I maybe he was the person who ran some like bloggers group I was a part of a while ago. Um, I haven't talked to any of the Wizards people in like 10 years, so I don't think so. Um, Back to like really quick to the genre thing. I mean, I imagine if Jason is still in chat, like it's very similar to writing, where I mean, any kind of writing genre is going to be kind of arbitrary. Like is this book a romance? Is it science fiction? Is it horror? Does it really matter? It's just about like just trying to get it in front of the right audience so you can sell the most books. You know,
Right.
and if marketing Merkborg as OSR more often than not gets it into the hands of the people who like it, then God bless them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, because like you said, I think it's definitely become a term that people have adapted into making it their own. And I think most of those games that are considered OSR now are not retro clones. And I think, like you said, I think it all started
Yeah.
as retro clones. If it's not basically OD&D or AD&D, like old school essentials would be considered like OSR in your book, right? Like it's literally
Yeah,
basically a retro
absolutely.
clone. So
Yeah,
anything
or
that's
something like
rules light but
Rogue
not a
Spire.
retro clone. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, Dude, we gotta play Master of the Rogue Spire sometime soon. Um, but um, but yeah, it has become this kind of like broad thing, and it's funny because I recently read an article where the guy who created the original like quote unquote OSR logo has now like copyrighted it, I guess, so that people who have different political opinions to him can't use it, whether you agree with them or not. And then reading all of that kind of stuff, kind of digging into Reddit and digging like the hellholes that are like Twitter and Reddit and things like that. Um, a lot of people were saying the same kind of thing, where like OSR doesn't really mean anything anymore. It's just it's a spectrum of game styles that are just started with one thing and it become this whole other thing. So you don't need a logo, you don't need this, you don't need that. There's nobody out there who's going to call something an official OSR product or not. Just it
Yeah,
is what it is, and it's either a retro clone or rules light, and do whatever you want to do with it. So yeah, again, a lot of it's
yeah,
marketing, and a lot of it the same thing with what I said with like D&D 5e, like whether it's a good on ramp or not as far as rules go. Hasbro and WotC have made it extremely readily available. I mean, there's D&D nerds, candy and shit. Like it's everywhere. There's D&D in what's that TV show on Netflix? It blew up with that too. Stranger Things and stuff like that. So, like you
yeah,
said, whether it's a good game or not, it's easily accessible. So a
yeah,
lot of it has become marketing, which it becomes its own kind of evil when it comes to that, and you can just try to ignore it and look at the mechanics of the game to decide what kind of game you want to play.
yeah. So, do we want to talk more about? I'm feeling pretty energetic. I was only planning to do 90 minutes, but I'm feeling pretty good. Did you want to talk more about your basic? You have more questions, or what do you want to
Yeah,
do?
yeah, we kind of tangented pretty hard there for about an hour.
Yeah,
But yeah, um, yeah. I mean, I probably have a million questions about Victory Basic. Um, when you were So you originally created it specifically. Now my question is, now that we were just talking about the OSR genre and all that rest of it, did any of that come into your mind when you were making this at all, or was it literally just like, we really like Dungeon World. We don't necessarily, I know you previously talked about the way the Dungeon World community was at the time, so you were just like, I just want to make this game for my friends to play a game the way we want to play the game. Did any of that come into your mind at all? I know that your intention, you said your intention was to not, make it publicly readily available. Um, but I guess, in addition to that, why not? I guess is my other question.
why not make it publicly available? Like, why not sell it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think to hit on the OSR thing, I never actually got along with the OSR people.
Mm.
Um, so I really never had any interest in contributing to their community, I guess. The second was try not put it out. I guess I didn't want to put the work in to make something that rose to the standard of being publishable. Because when you're just making something for your friends, like I don't have to get it edited, I don't have to get artwork done. It goes into making something high enough quality that people would be willing to, spend money on it. There's some other stuff related. I don't know how much I want to get into it, like with the Adam Coble stuff,
Oh yeah.
and just like, just how it'd be weird. Like I'm not super plugged in to the D&D. Like I don't use social media, and I kind of know through the grapevine what happens. But just is it taboo to put something out that's kind of attached to his work? But yeah, it's I also just don't know if there's really an appetite for another thing like this. Like there's already, I feel like retro clones in particular are such a saturated sort of market. There's already a million white box retro clones, and at the time when I was putting together white box, I'd already started to transition away from tabletop RPG stuff. And if I were to put Victory Basic out, it would just, again, it would kind of take away from the time I wanted to spend on other projects. I will say though that kind of the recent interest has shifted my thinking a little bit on this. I am working on the fourth volume. I have posted the PDFs in chat. What I might do, I'll post the link in the Victory Basic channel on Discord, and maybe you can sticky it or pin it or whatever so people can grab it. And I've not said this anywhere publicly yet, so I'll kind of do like a little fun exclusive announcement here. Haven't committed to this 100% yet, but my tentative plan right now is for next spring to put together an omnibus edition on Lulu that people can purchase at cost that has all 4 booklets in one little book that you can just buy as a print version off of Lulu if you want to have it. So I'm just gonna put all the PDFs together, and then you can just go to Lulu and just buy it at cost. It'll be no profit to me. It won't be edited at all. I'm not going to do anything nice. It's just like it's going to be as is. So haven't 100% committed to that yet. Like I said, I need to talk to some people because I did promise in the box set that I wasn't going to sell this, make it available. So I just want to make sure they're not going to feel like I ruined their Christmas present by giving it to the masses. But if people are interested, there are ways to get a hold of it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would love an omnibus. Well, I think this. No shit, it's off screen. Starting right here. I feel like I have everything you've ever physically published that's still available. So of course I would snatch up an omnibus edition in a heartbeat. I can't wait to have the fourth one by itself. I feel like you're underestimating the quality too. Like when you're like, oh, it's not edited, there's no art. It's full of art. It's incredibly well done. I mean, I can't, like, I would, you're like, I just made this for some friends. This is, to me, this would be like if I could create something like this, I would be happy with life. Like, I'd be like, I created a thing and I'm good. And you're just like, this is just a little thing that I did for my friends or whatever. I definitely think you're vastly underestimating like the quality of work and like how much the people that do actually get to have your work really appreciate it. At least that's my perspective, and I know that Andy and Matt and Jason and everyone feel the exact same way too. So yeah, I would. There's not much I wouldn't do to get an omnibus edition of this. But yeah, I know of what happened with the Dungeon World stuff, but I know people are still putting out Dungeon World stuff and things like that. But yeah, Matt said it's very elegant. And it is. I love this game. I love this game so much. I can't wait to continue to play it. If I had a home game right now, this is the system that I'd be using. I would definitely have stopped playing 5e a while ago, and this is the system that I'd be playing with because it is, at least where I'm at in my tabletop, lifespan, the exact style of game that I want to play. And especially after playing it once last week, like I think I immediately messaged you after and was like, I have not had this much fun running a game in a very long time. So it's I don't know. I think people would love it, and I think we're in a great time in tabletop gaming right now for a game like this to come out. So I can imagine people would really really get a kick out of it. But again, I mean, I also know from talking to you personally how many projects you work at any given time. I don't understand how one person's able to put in this much work. But I completely understand where you're coming from, where it's just like the amount of work that it would take to put something like this out in a mass produced way would really take time away from the other things that you're working on right now. Things like, and I don't think we've talked about this yet, even though I've dropped it in the chat a couple of times, your the new course you wrote. Did you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah. So really quick though, before we jump into that, like it sounds like if people are cool with just the books being printed as they are without really being edited or changed in any way, then yeah, I can definitely do an omnibus edition because that's just me taking the PDFs and smushing them together and throwing them up on Lulu.
Yeah.
So that can definitely happen. So yeah, the online course just came out on Monday. I've been working on this for a while. It's called Choice Design and Solo Adventure Game Books. Those who might not be familiar with the term, game books are choose an adventure books. Can't legally call them that. That's a trademark term. But if you're familiar with choose an adventure or fighting fantasy or lone wolf, that's what that is. That's kind of the world I work in these days. And I out a course through Storytelling Collective, which is a group that specializes in online courses for different kinds of interactive storytelling. They also do Write Your First Adventure, which is a pretty popular course for people to learn how to write their own adventures for games like D&D or Call of Cthulhu. And basically, it's a self-paced course, so you don't have to like physically sit down in front of a computer at a certain time. You register for the course, you get access to it, and you have all the materials forever. You can go through it at your own pace. It's a theory-based course, so what it does is it's me basically going through all of the game design theory stuff and distilling it down into what is hopefully language that is understandable for folks who don't really have a game design background, to give you like a vocabulary and a framework for designing choices for choose your own adventure or fighting fantasy type books that people will find interesting. And one of the things I would recommend is, even if you're not really doing game books, if you're writing D&D adventures, I would still recommend, and I'm not just saying this because I want the registration fee, I would recommend checking out the course and going through the lessons, because I think the takeaways are very valuable for writing tabletop RPG adventures as well.
Yeah, I mean that's how I feel. Like I've seen a little bit of the course material and stuff like that, or we've talked about a lot of the things that are in it, and I know that the way that I run dungeons, the way that I write adventures is different because of the conversations that we've had specifically on this exact topic. And very much so, when you boil it down to those kind of choice options, even as far down to something like Victory Basic, which we already said, everything you do, every roll you make is a choice. You really get to see it in play. But it's really interesting to, even in 5th edition, like you just said, as a DM, whatever edition that you're playing, writing a story and choosing what, the players are going to do and how they're going to interact with the world. It all comes down to choices and being able to see a course that is specifically designed to explain all those different kind of choices and how they work and how you can utilize them in a game perspective is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly helpful. Both hearing it from like a player's perspective, understanding kind of the situations that you find yourself in, and then as a DM being able to put people in those situations to create the exact kind of tension or story beats that you want is really, really enlightening and helpful.
Yeah, and the big thing that I try to do is give people a vocabulary so that they can design mindfully. Because I think what a lot of people struggle with, and it's something I struggled with for a long time, was that you're sort of freestyling it when you're designing something like writing a game book or designing an adventure where you're putting together an encounter and you want to come up with a trap. And you'll even see this like when people post on Twitter or social media, like, I'm trying to come up with a trap. Does anybody have any ideas? And people are just sort of throwing ideas out, and there's no real rhyme or reason to why people are suggesting the things that they're suggesting. And my thing is trying to reach out into the broader theory and writing about game design to give you a toolkit so that you're not having to just sort of grope in the dark for ideas, but rather it's like, okay, I am trying to accomplish this specific thing in my design. What do I have in my toolkit, and how can I design something to get me where I want to go? Right. And that for me is very empowering because you can design with intention. You can be mindful about what you're doing, and I think that results in better products. And then also helps you articulate, like if you're working with other designers, like if you've partnered up with somebody or working on a team, you can then articulate to them why you did the thing that you did. Because in my real world job, I work on a design systems team. That's what I have to do every day. Like, you know, we have to explain to people why we've made the decisions that we've made about designs that are going to impact, a massive organization, and you can't just go up there and be like, well, we made this decision because that's what we felt in our hearts. It's like, no, we have to fall back on broader principles and things that we can demonstrate, you know. So I wanted to bring some of that to the table.
Yeah.
And I do have Andy. He noted the treasure course. I do have another course on there. It's about treasure design in tabletop RPGs, and I think they're running a promotion right now. It's called like Level Up Your Game Design, where they've bundled a bunch of courses together. And I think both my choice design course and the treasure course are in that bundle. So if you really want to go ham, you can get a bunch of the courses at a discount bundled together.
Yeah, and I highly recommend it. Um, I feel like when you're a new DM, a lot of this stuff is kind of formulaic. Like there's explanations for things, kind of, and you're just like, okay, I'll just do this because this is this and this is that. And then the more experience you get with it, the more things like, especially with your treasure course, you realize things can be a lot more impactful than just like, oh, you found gold, cool. Like it's not just a resource you found; it's a choice you get to make, and it is rewards for certain things, or even choices within those rewards based on like the items and things you'd place, or even the reason you put the treasure there, or things like that. And the same thing, comes down for the choice design stuff, where you get to really kind of, I don't even know how to say this, so I want to say it, like really dictate people's options, but also even just the vibe of the game that you're playing based on the choices you present to people. So you can really, with story writing or with game design or with anything, everything you do is a choice. You choose to do the things that you do, and then you get to suffer the consequences from those things, whether those are good or bad. So I very much highly recommend it. I know a lot of people within our community have gone through the course. So definitely check those out. It's just at sersavictory.com. That it's just the header on your main page right now, right?
That's
Yep,
correct.
right
And you can
there.
click the link
Yeah,
and it'll
yeah.
take you through. And it looks like Andy, is it designed similarly to the treasure course? Yes, it's very similar in format. I found the assignments helpful. Oh, thank you. I'm glad that you found that stuff helpful.
Yeah. One of the things I really enjoy about our discussions about game design and about talking and things like that is exactly what you said, like giving people the vocabulary. Is this could be like super academic and really crunchy and hard to dig into, but you make it incredibly like approachable. where like I might in a broad way understand a concept but not really have the ability to describe it in the way that I want to. um, and then you've really helped me a lot in order not only to understand a lot of that stuff but be able to communicate it effectively, which has been really really helpful because when I'm kind of getting all of this info from you and it's kind of distilled into the part that I understand, and then I can pass what I understand on to someone else. It makes it, like you just said, the exact reason you wrote it, really, really helpful to be able to communicate those choices with other people. And when you're writing a game, like I'm still playing around with writing my own little game and system like that. And when I talk about it to someone like Hunter, I can explain why I made the choices I made a lot more easily now because of a lot of conversations that we've had. Um, so,
I'm glad that the conversations have been helpful, and I think, I mean, for me at least, it makes the process more fun because I don't enjoy when I don't feel like I know what I'm doing, you know? And when I felt like I got to a point where with game books, I'm at that point now where choice design comes pretty easily. And so now I can focus on the bigger picture stuff, like how can I tell an interesting story across the course of the game book and come up with an interesting premise and focus on those sorts of things instead of sitting and tapping my pencil and trying to come up with like an interesting choice, like once you get those low level things um, in the back of your brain. Like I just took an online course by this author Dean Wesley Smith, and he talks a lot about like the critical voice in the front of your brain and the creative voice kind of in the back of your brain. And he's like, you want to be able to write from your creative voice in the back of your brain. And the way that you do that is when you learn things, they become part of your creative voice. You just sort of absorb them, and you get to a point where you don't even have to think about them anymore, right? And that's kind of the idea, is that at first you're kind of learning these new things, and it's like, okay, I'm thinking about choice design, and I'm thinking about cliffhangers, I'm thinking about plot structure, and for a while it feels kind of forced because you're just learning them. But then you get to a point where it's like it's like the back of your hand, it's like the back of your head. And once you start to be able to just internalize that stuff, it becomes a lot more fun to write things or create things or design games because you're just not struggling to come up with those things. You're just like, oh, I can come up with interesting choices or interesting encounters. Like I'm coming up, I just got asked to do a head-to-head D&D bar crawl. I got asked to write an adventure for that, for one, in town. And I was able to come up with like the skeleton of the adventure overnight. And now I can just focus on like the cool parts of it, like what's going to be the cool scenery, because I've already got like the fundamentals, the bones of the encounters and stuff worked out because I know what's an interesting encounter structure. What are the dungeon moments? I lean on those pretty heavily. What are the interesting choices? And really at this point it's just like what's going to be a cool premise? What's going to be exciting for the theme of this bar crawl?
dude, why can't we
So
have adventure themed bar crawls here? That's we gotta get Eric and Matt and Andy together and do something like that here. That sounds badass. It's literally like what is the structure of that? Like it's literally like you're doing an adventure throughout the course, or throughout the bar crawl, or is each bar crawl a different adventure, like each stop?
so the way it works is it's kind of like a Tower of Gygax thing where there's 3 rooms, 3 encounters, and then there's 2 teams, and it's like a scored timed thing. The teams split up, they go to one bar, play through one encounter, and then when they travel to the next area, they go to the next bar, play that encounter, and then at the end of the 3 sessions, they all meet up at the last place, and then they do the tallying of the score and everybody drinks. And yeah, we did it years ago, before the pandemic and stuff like that, and it was a huge hit. I actually still have the bar crawl module somewhere. I can share it with you and
Oh yeah, please do.
show
That'd
you
be
what it was like.
awesome. You had mentioned cliffhangers before, and getting back into Victory Basic a little bit. One of the great things at the end of the adventure, I know you messaged me like during the combat and were like, "Don't forget to roll on this table." And I totally forgot to roll on that table, so we rolled at the end. Um, and is now the table that you sent me that I rolled on? That's not in the original trilogy of books, right? That's in the new one.
Yes, that's correct.
Because at the very end, so we do two things at the end of the adventure. One is to roll a D100 for an event for when people leave, right? So if they rest for the night, they roll on the table. And then somebody rolled in chat, and they rolled a. I don't think anyone here is a player. No, it doesn't look like anyone in here is any of the players. But they rolled like a. I think Phoenix rolled like a 42 or something like that. So nothing happens. So basically, the dungeon stays the way the dungeon is. But the way I'm looking back through our chat trying to find that table that you sent me. That is a super fun, an incredibly I really, really enjoyed that a lot. Where it's like when you're wrapping up the adventure, how can you wrap it up where it's not just like, okay, session's over, everybody, but you always leave like the tension and the cliffhanger, which I think was like a perfect addition to like the rest of the tension throughout the entire course. I think when suddenly Moose got dragged back in, that was another one of my favorite parts in the adventure. Yeah, I can't find it. I don't know if you sent it to me as a link or as a picture, and I'm not digging into it. But leaving something on a cliffhanger like that, I guess my question, bringing that up, first of all, it's awesome. But second of all, I know that you said that this is, it's Dungeon World, but it's kind of, like an OD&D thing. You modeled it after OD&D as far as you said, like parsing things out and stuff like that. But things like that, how much of that is, because I've never read Dungeon World, how much of that is different from OD&D and Dungeon World, and it's just things that you've added on, versus kind of like doing the homage to OD&D or using the Dungeon World system. Like how much of in Victory Basic is things like that you've added into it, versus the way that the game itself was.
I would say probably there's not a whole lot of Dungeon World in it. I mean, it's got
Okay.
the 2d6 mechanic, and I think like the GM moves and principles are mostly the same. I did add a couple that are more kind of Death Trap dungeon oriented. Um, but not a whole lot. Like there's a lot of stuff in Dungeon World that I just didn't use because it's either like story focused or prep focused, or like the classes are completely different and that kind of thing. Um, I did use like I think the way equipment works is like there's no equipment lists, which is something that I don't enjoy. I don't like spending gold to buy like a sword and a rope. I like the abstraction of you have like a dungeoneer's kit, and you're just assumed to be able to have like if I need a rope, I can just spend my kit to have a rope. Um, a lot of it is OD&D, so like the treasure tables are pretty much OD&D and basic D&D, with a little splash of advanced. Yeah, most of Victory Basic is like OD&D.
Okay.
That's just been kind of cleaned up a tiny bit, and the classes are a little bit of a mixture. And then for the new book, it's the supplements from OD&D. They did a couple supplemental books like Greyhawk, Blackmoor, Eldritch Wizardry, and there's another one that I'm blanking on right now. And then a little bit of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons just to round it out. And then this fourth book has some stuff that I've added. I did add some stuff to the fighter. So, like Henchman, for example, is actually based off a mechanic that I did in an old fourth core book like 10 years ago, uh, where you could basically, you had like these little narrative twists that you could introduce that represented followers that you had. Because what I wanted to do was give fighters a little bit more to do. I still kept like the what do they call it, like linear fighters, quadratic wizards, that old D&D has, where wizards start off really frail, and then as they gain power, like they get really powerful kind of really quickly,
Mhm.
whereas fighters start off okay, but they never really get like super crazy powerful, you know? Which again, if I was designing a game today, I wouldn't do it that way. I actually like the way Fourth did it, where classes were pretty similar in their power structure. They just had different roles they played. That was like the ideal way to do it in my mind. But I didn't like the idea that wizards only had like one spell. So actually, wizards and clerics have a lot more spells at first level in traditional OD&D, and then fighters have a lot more options because I don't like where it's like, well, I can swing my sword and that's it. So they have power attack. They have the henchman thing where they get that once per game, where they can call upon henchmen to introduce like a twist in the narrative. So I think Ginger has the archers that let the party retreat, which I think they used last game to escape.
Yeah. He used it. He used it. I love the archers, and I love like the way that you wrote them as like they're it's abstract. You don't have like 10 people running around with you with bows. But I think the way you wrote it is like they just happen to show up at just the right time. When you need them there. So basically, they played it as they said fuck this fight, which was my favorite part, because in 5e they would have just kept swinging until everyone was dead. They were
Yeah.
just like, there's a clear path to the treasure, can I snatch it all up in one go, then let's get the fuck out of here, who cares. And then Ginger was like, yeah, like the henchmen burst in at just the right time, fire some arrows and let us escape, from the kobolds and the goblins and everything. And then yeah, I really really loved that mechanic a lot with the henchmen. So it's really neat that, especially the once a game, it's like basically once a session that can happen, right?
Yeah. And again, it also shows the way that your game's mechanics dictate player behavior, because you don't get experience by killing monsters. The only way you get experience is by um, getting treasure out of the dungeon. And so as soon as they scooped up all the gold, there was no reason to keep fighting. Like they got what they needed, you know what I mean? So
Yep.
there was no point in drawing that battle out into a slog. So
Right. Well,
again, it
even
just,
even the previous
your
room
scoring
with
system.
the yeah, even the previous room with the treasure chest with the carrion crawlers. At first they were like, maybe we'll shoot past, but we want to look at it as we go by and see if it's worth stopping. And then once the cleric failed, I think before they even helped them, they were like, all right, well, if we're stuck in this room, let's go check out this treasure. And they both, the mage and the fighter, both went over there and were like, all right, let's check this out. And I think the thought process in their mind was, if we don't have to fight these things to the death and we can just snatch the treasure, we can just save the cleric and roll out. Which, exactly like you just said, when treasure is the way to earn experience, you don't have to fight everything. You can just go for the treasure and just move on, and you don't create that kind of sense that like you kind of get with 5e, where you feel like the combat is the point and you murder the monsters. And the fact that in a lot of games, XP is tied to the monster, so you have to kill the monster in order to get the XP, which discourages people from running away. That can really cascade through all of your mechanics, where it's like, okay, well, if they're not going to run away, then I have to make it balanced. It can't be over hard, because I'll just assume it's balanced for them and then all die. So I really enjoy that the gold in Victory Basic is the point, because I love encouraging players to run away. I use milestone leveling. I don't use XP, so you don't have to kill everything. You can just walk right past some stuff if you want to. So it's
Yeah.
fun to do that, and fun to see how, like you just said, it can shape the way that the players play the game. Which is neat. Like if you just give something a little bit of sparkle, they're gonna be like, ah, shit, that's how I'm gonna get to level 2. Let's go do this. So
It gives you more wiggle room as a designer to make monsters dangerous, because not only are the players you know encouraged to run away or find ways to avoid monsters, um, they're given the tools to do so. That's why utility spells and utility items are so common in these kinds of games. And in fact, one of the new tables in um, Volume 4 is called Oddities, and it's items that aren't useful in the way that wondrous items or normal treasure is. They're just weird things that you're going to have to find a use for. You know, like it's a coin that when you flip it always lands on heads. Or like it's a light that can only be seen by a certain kind of monster that you get to decide at the start of every day. You know what I mean? Like stuff that it's forcing you to think like, how can I use this in some kind of strange way? Because actually, I think the Principia Apocrypha book talks about that, where it's the dungeon becomes this strange puzzle that encourages you to find ways to use the equipment that you have in creative ways to overcome the challenges. Um, and so with monsters, you can make them extremely dangerous. Like those carrion crawlers, their average damage would have killed the wizard in one hit, and would have
Yep.
likely killed the cleric in like 2 or 3 hits. The reason you can get away with that is because the players are not supposed, in most cases, to go toe to toe with those monsters. If they were, then the players would be like, well, this isn't fair. This is, quote, unbalanced. But because the players are told explicitly, and because the game system, through its mechanics and through the equipment they're given, through spells and items and that sort of thing, pushes them to find ways to, you know, avoid monsters or distract them or evade them. You can make the monsters more deadly, which again contributes to that sense of dread and that feeling of like, oh God, we could get fucked at any moment here. Again, it's all those systems working in tandem to create the play experience that you want. And I think the people that came through, I think that's why it was a really engaging session for not just the players, but I think for the audience. Like again, I was really surprised that people were as engaged as they were in the chat.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It was so much fun, and and the more you play it, the more it feels like it's not designed to be balanced, but it feels balanced, if that makes sense. Like, the number of carrion crawlers, like when you look through the monsters, for example, like it gives you a number of carrion crawlers and like the dice the hit dice that you roll for them or whatever. But with the way the mechanic worked and stuff like that with hits versus failures and whether things were in close proximity or far proximity, Ginger, I think, he fully succeeded. He had a full success on like one or two of the hits against those guys, and then rolled crazy damage, and then used a power. If all they did was use the basic hits, yeah, I think they could have got taken out. And what was cool too is when they fought the goblins and kobolds. Like it's 5 goblins and 5 kobolds. The kobolds weren't even trying to fight them until they cleaved and killed one of the kobolds. But even though Ginger, I think pretty much every time he hit, killed a kobold or killed a goblin or whatever. There was 10 of them, and I think by the end there was still like 4 left, and they were like grinding and grinding, and it's just like I love that it got to the point where the mage was, Hunter was basically like, I'm out. I gotta stop rolling because I'm gonna get killed. So if I keep doing that, and then, like you said previously, they basically said, well, the treasure's the important part. That's what we came for. We've cleared the way to the treasure. Let's take that and run. It felt like incredibly appropriate for the situation. And that just means that it's designed incredibly well. Like the treasure's the point, so you go for the treasure. It's not incredibly overwhelming for the space, because I rolled up that entire encounter. We rolled up everything. So when I rolled on the table, it was like I think the counter was like you have 2 monsters fighting each other or something like that. And then when I looked at you have a table for the monsters that are in per dungeon type. So in traditional dungeon, you get goblins and halflings, or goblins and kobolds are 2 of the things in there. And then there's a number of appearance, which is 5 to 10. So I said, okay, if it's a monster fighting another monster, let's have 5 goblins versus 5 kobolds. And I think I think when we rolled in that room, we rolled for a dais. So it's just like, okay, well, if 5 kobolds are fighting 5 monsters and there's a dais in the room, kobolds are trapsmiths and goblins are assholes. So the goblins are probably trying to fight the kobolds for something that's on the dais. And then that's how it turned into this, kind of like, I think we even rolled up that there's a relic in there, and it's like, okay, well then it's a dragon relic because these things worship dragons. So it's crazy how the roll tables within the thing, literally like 4 rolls turned that entire encounter into how awesome it was. And that's how we got moments like the mage hand with the relic trap, and the players actually using the archery henchmen, and going for the treasure and fighting the way through that whole room and everything like that. It's just crazy how well the game works, the mechanics work, and the game is written to create this situation now that is like, one of those game moments where like I can pick out 4 moments in 70 sessions of Dark Kingdoms where I'm like, these are things I really remember. But there's some highlights in that first session, but the entire session for me was just like, fuck, I remember the first time. I know 5 years from now I'm going to be like, I remember the first time I ran Victory Basic, like this and this and this and this and this, you know what I mean? It created this amazing, like, tense moments within the game that we were playing. So yeah.
I appreciate that, and also good night to man. I think he's going to bed here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really quick about that the dragon idol, like, to go back to one of the things we were talking about earlier in our discussion about the random tables and that sort of bowl of oatmeal problem, or just the way that random tables can be kind of boring sometimes. I think back to a lot of the tables I've seen for the random generation of traps. A lot of the time it's like, you might get, so okay, maybe it's a dart or it's a spear, and that's fine, but very infrequently do I see tables that really let you come up with interesting effects for traps. A lot of the times it's like, okay, you can generate what kind of trap it is, but ultimately it's still just like you deal 1d6 damage and maybe you impose a condition from the DMG, like they're poisoned or they're dazed or something. And what I really liked about that encounter with the idol is that, one of the things that I put in Volume 3 of Victory Basic is that list of trap effects, which are actually just the GM moves that have been reskinned. And I think for that one we rolled, it's a trap, it's an elemental jet, so it was a fire jet, but it separates the Dungeoneers.
Yep.
And so that created that interesting moment where, it breathed fire and it dealt fire damage, but we also had that fun moment where they were like, hey, wizard, why do you keep running into the front line? You should retreat. And I think it was like right at that moment, you had it breathe fire, and now the wizard can't retreat. Right. That's not something that would have happened if the roll table was just, oh, you have a trap that does 1d6 damage. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of what I'm always trying to think about with the roll tables is how can these enable people like you come up with interesting interactions at game time, not just be like, here's just a big old bowl of oatmeal and it's like every trap does damage and is, projectile or something. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, yeah, and in that moment too, I think Hunter or Mage was pretty low, and then suddenly there's a wall of flame where on his side there's literally just him and 2 kobolds.
That's right. So he was,
yeah,
he was in trouble.
And I think, if I remember correctly, gosh, it was only a week ago. I think someone deactivated the trap too before even like the end of the round. I think somebody. Oh, I think didn't the cleric use command to command one of the kobolds to disable the trap?
Yes, I think that's right.
Yeah. So, which was another great way to utilize the game and the things within the game, as opposed to like just doing damage or something like that. Because if it got back to the mage stuck on one side of the firewall versus these 2 kobolds, he was going to have to do something. So whether he was going to try to run through the flames or fight the kobolds or do something with his health as low as he was, if he had to go toe to toe with those kobolds on that side by himself and cast a spell against one of them, there's a chance he could have died right there.
Yeah. One of the things I like about the encounters in a game like Victory Basic is that like every turn it just feels like something different is happening. I'm gonna make an incredibly annoying reference, but like one of my favorite musical projects is Enigma, that kind of new agey ambient type stuff. And the producer, Michael Credu, gave an interview years and years ago, and he said one of the things that he makes sure that he does with his music is that no four bars in his songs are the same. That every four bars is different from another four bars in each song. And I always think about that when I'm making like my encounters. It's like no turn should ever be the same as the turn, any other turn of the adventure. Because I think we've all played or run games like that where it's like every turn in the encounter is the same. The monsters do the same thing, the players do the same thing. And for me,
Mhm.
like when adventures are the most fun is when every single turn in the encounter, something different is happening. Something new is being introduced or a new tactic is being deployed. And I really felt that with that dragon encounter where it's like every turn it just seemed like something was changing about the scene. And I think that's harder to do in games. I found it harder to do in games like D&D for a number of reasons. Um, it's like we were talking about the monster stat blocks, because monsters and traps just have bullet points for what they can do on their turn. You can just sort of freestyle it and be like, I have all these different things I can choose from, and I can just say, okay, well, the kobolds can channel the magic of their dragon ancestors. That means they can breathe fire this turn, or you know. But one of the drawbacks is that you know it requires an excellent game master like yourself. I think a lot of people would struggle in that position because you really have to know how to improvise. Because there's a
Well,
lot of people I think who would have to have like, this is the monster, these are the powers that it has. This is literally what it can do. Like it can move 6 squares, and then it can breathe a cone of fire. It's a burst 5, and it's a saving throw DC 13. Like if you were to give somebody well, what does it mean, channel dragon magic? What's the damage roll I should do? You know what I mean? Like I think if someone had less experience as a game master, I don't know if the game would be as fun. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's always the drawback with games like this is
well, yeah.
there can be a pretty steep learning curve. And a lot of people who played Dungeon World who ran it for the first time, I think had a similar experience where it's hard to wrap your head around.
Well, I completely agree, and I had previously played a couple of Powered by the Apocalypse games, like I said, Casket Lands and Monster of the Week. And I remember the first time I ran Casket Lands, like the first hour, I was just like fumbling. And Sam who had run Monster of the Week before was like gives me these tips and stuff like that. But eventually, like it just kind of clicks, and you're like, oh, okay. But it's kind of hard. I said this previously when I run fifth edition on Wednesday to get into that mindset. I feel like it took me like a good hour, and I was even like messaging you like, what could I do here? What could I do this? Or like, where I was like, man, I really need to come up with like what happens when spells go wrong. And you gave me a little list and stuff like that, but eventually it clicks in, and you're just like, oh, like, anything I fucking want. Like you just have to remember that it's just anything you want. And one of the things I really like is that the monsters don't get a turn in initiative. So things can happen, right? So like for example, if someone hits a kobold, um, but they got like a 7, it's not necessarily that kobold that has to hit back. It's anything you want to happen.
Right.
So another kobold over there that's not engaged, what I had happen, was like a caster used magic missile. Sure, magic missile went off, but something bad happened. Okay, that kobold over there that isn't engaged, or the goblin, has a short bow and shoots you, and gets to roll damage on you. So it's nice. One of the things that's great about that kind of system versus fifth edition, where, like you said earlier, one of the things I hate the most is when people are fighting in doorways and they're just standing there, and you have a line of enemies lined up, shoulder to shoulder to shoulder, and a doorway, and a line of good guys, shoulder to shoulder to shoulder. Um, and they just do the same thing. All right, I hit. Okay, I hit. Okay, I hit. Okay, I hit. You know what I mean? Um, And it just becomes this redundant thing that people aren't invested in, and people start to tune out when it's just like, well, this is all I have left is just I swing my sword, and they swing their sword, and they swing their sword. And I really
Yeah.
love how in Victory Basic, um, like you just said, you don't know what's going to happen. Anything could happen. It could be a trap. It could be the ceiling falls down. It could be, the creature you hits you, or the creature over here hits you, or this guy over here casts a spell because you failed your spell. There's literally anything that you can imagine can happen on a mixed success or a failure. And it's much more freeing once you can wrap your head around that. I will say there is a learning curve to it. And I'm going to be, rolling some stuff up and practicing a little bit before next session to make sure that I'm in the correct mindset from it. But definitely, once you get past that little bit of a learning curve, to me, it just feels like a more fun game to play. It's a more fun game to GM. I can imagine it's a more fun game to play because of the intensity, because of the variety. Exactly what you just said, like no two turns are exactly the same. But specifically from a GM perspective, it's so much more fun than 5th edition because I'm not constrained to, like you just said, like I have this monster, there are these 3 actions I can do, and that's all I can do. So
Yeah, and just from a formatting perspective, like I was telling you before we started the stream, like I'm finishing up Chapel of Grief, and just the verbosity of the stat blocks. Like you really only have enough room for maybe 2 or 3 interesting powers, per monster, and in Victory Basic, I can have 5 or 6 bullet points and really have a monster with a lot of interesting options that I can pull from turn to turn, and that's just something that really appeals to me. It's also just quicker to write up. And I know this is a phrase that you used a lot on your streams, and it's one that I like to use as well, which is kind of favoring the rulings over the rules. Like I enjoy being able to freestyle because I'm comfortable with the improv aspect, and I enjoy being able to let the game surprise me, because it's very much like, in my mind, I'm kind of just doing like a tabletop roguelike. I'm not terribly interested in trying to make sure there's this story that we're all telling together that stays on the rails. Like, no, I'm just here to watch the chaos. So
yeah,
I've
exactly.
got maybe, I don't know, another 15 minutes. I don't know if there's anybody left in the chat who has any questions, or if you have some stuff you wanted to ask, or what.
I'm trying to think. I mean, again, this is one of those things where, like, if I should have wrote down more questions, but a lot of it is, the last question I asked was one of the things I really wanted to know. Was, I know this is Dungeon World and OD&D, but how much of it is just Sersa Victory? And the answer being like most of it. Feels about right. It feels very Sersa Victory, and that's one of the things I really enjoy. Like, that, like, I fell in love with your content as far back as Necropolis the Mailed Fist, especially we ran that for the tournament. To me, as far as 5e goes, I think Necropolis will. I mean, maybe Chapel of Grief will change my mind. But Necropolis is my favorite 5e thing that I've ever run. I can't think of anything
I
that's even
appreciate
close
that.
to. Yeah, I can't even think of anything that's even close to how much fun it was to run, and the lore in it, which is just amazing, and just exactly how I want, like, game lore to be, which is like dark but beautiful, I guess is a way to describe it. But Victory Basic, to me, I mean, it's really, knowing you the way I know you, it's super evident that this is your game, if that makes sense. Like, I can't really think of a way that, when I read this, where I'm not like, I see Sersa in this line, and I see Sersa in this line, and obviously you wrote all of them, but you know what I'm saying, that it's just, it's very
Yeah.
clearly comes from your mind, and your style of play. And it's also really interesting too, knowing you as well as I do and playing your 5e stuff, to see where you're like, well, this is the game that I wanted to play, so this is the game that I made. Um, and to know all of the things that we've talked about, like choice design and game design and all the rest of it, to see it kind of distilled down into this actual thing that I can actually hold in my hands, and not only that, actually get to play. So again, I don't think a lot of people really get the experience that I get to experience, where, like, you're my favorite content creator in the tabletop world. I don't think there's a lot of people that get to sit down and have chats with their favorite content creator and build a game with their favorite content creator as far as like the using their system to run a game and then having them in your chat watching you run that game. I don't think a lot of people get to experience that. So I do want to say that just that it's really special for me, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate. All the way back to when we ran Necropolis, the Mailed Fist of the meetup to now, just how I don't know, just how special that is to me, and I just want to say I really appreciate that.
Oh, that means a lot to me. Like, I'll definitely say your enthusiasm is a tremendous source of motivation for me, and I mean, I think I wouldn't get half as much done if I didn't have like your encouragement. So I really appreciate you.
I still have that tag. I made this thing a while back because again a lot of you guys don't know, or based on our conversations that we have, just how much Sersa Victory does and the number of projects he's got on his plate and the amount of things that he actually accomplishes. I mean, just go check out his website for all the things he's done, even within the past 2 years. But I have this little tag that I have up when I'm working on my game that just says get. I think it's like get done 1/10 of what Sersa does, and that's my motivation. Is just like, man, if he can put out something like this, and he can do all the projects he's working on now, then you can just get up off the couch and go work on your project for an hour. So definitely motivates me.
What
So.
the risk of being too, I don't know, saccharine or whatever. Like, I'm a big believer in like you don't write for an audience, you write for like a specific person. And I can definitely tell you, like with Chapel of Grief in particular, like I'm not writing for an audience. I'm writing for you. Like I'm like, will Ryan like this adventure? Like I'll give you a great example. I just last night was working on rules for character creation for the adventure. There's no pre-gens with it, but it's like, here's the rules you have to follow. And one of the bullet points is no multi-classing. And I'm like, yeah, he's going to love this.
Oh yeah, fucking hate it. Yeah. That's
Yeah, I'm a big
awesome.
believer in that. Like, it just helps. I think it helps you visualize, just write, write for a specific person and keep them in mind as opposed to trying to write for a big kind of faceless mass. And I think you'll dig it. The people who have play tested it and read some of the other stuff, the thing they keep saying is like, this feels like Blasphemous, the tabletop game. So
Oh yeah, well,
even more so than Mailed Fist. So
yeah, no, I mean, well, I still think Blasphemous is my favorite game I've ever played. One of the things, and a
good.
weird aside on it, one of the things I loved about Blasphemous versus a game like Disc Gambit, for example, and one of the things I don't really like about I guess Metroidvanias versus Soulsvanias and stuff like that is I don't like the ticky tack stat stuff, if that makes sense. Like
Yeah,
I don't want to find a sword that does 5% more fire damage and 1% more crit
yeah.
damage. You know what I
Like
mean? I
Bloodstained. There's
want
a lot of that in
yeah.
Bloodstained.
Yeah. Oh my fuck. I couldn't even finish the actual game. It was driving me up the goddamn wall. It's one of the only games I started that I haven't been able to finish. But like
There's
this
a lot of
Gambit did
that.
that. Yeah. And I think it's a little bit cleaner now that they've updated the game. But and it was relatively cleanish, but it's like you have to get a certain number of kills to level up like 1 point of like this, and when you level up 1 point of this, you increase your strength damage by 2% or something like that. That's annoying.
Yeah.
Blasphemous is literally just like you earn enough tiers to unlock a new ability, but I'm not looking for new swords. I'm not looking for new armor. I'm not looking for any of that stuff. I'm killing the things. I'm doing the puzzles. I'm exploring the world, and then I use that new ability to further be able to unlock other parts of the world, because there's things that you have to find just to be able to jump high enough to get to a certain thing. It's like Ori. I don't know if people appreciate how good of a fucking game Ori is.
Oh yeah.
But just like that, you're not ticky tacking stats and things like that. You're just learning new abilities that further allow you to explore the world, and that's one of the things I really really love about Blasphemous. So that's just a little aside about video games, I guess. Is I'm curious how Elden Ring is going to go, and I haven't played a lot of the actual Souls games. I want to, and I know I'm going to love them, especially for the lore and things like that. But I'm just not a fan of finding new armor, new weapons, and tiki tacking my way up to the top. Like a lot of the games where I think Skyrim, putting like a couple hundred hours into Skyrim really burnt me out on things like that. So it's one of the reasons I got
Yeah.
New World and wasn't able to dig too deep into New World. I was just like, I got this to play with friends, but I play at night when everyone's sleeping. All right, I'm not going to be putting too much into this. But if you created a game that feels like Blasphemous, it might knock Necropolis of the Mailed Fist right off from number one to number two, and Chapel of Grief might be the first. And Chapel of Grief is, it's a trilogy with Necropolis of the Mailed Fist and Tomb of Mercy, right?
Yes, it is the conclusion of like a trilogy-ish that began. I'll post a link here because I finally made the page public on my site so people can join the mailing list to get updates about the module.
I can't wait. And I know you sent me a little bit of the kind of like adventure summary for it, and it's
Yeah,
so good. It's so good. Um, when do you
it's gonna
think
be
that will
wild.
be? When do you think that will be like ready to go?
I'm hoping by Valentine's Day. I was hoping for Christmas, but um, it might not happen. But soon, getting there.
It's dope. And are we? If I unless I'm talking on my ass here, people are going to get like an exclusive first look when we run it here on the Adventure Archive, right?
That is my plan. My hope is, and we can work out the details, but my hope is that we do like the launch day through the Adventure Archive. Like basically, it launches night of the stream here.
Yeah, it's dope. Yeah, yeah. Dibs as a player. Sorry, Jason. I think that you're not quite suited, and I can talk to you about why for this game. Um, but I think Jess is definitely going to be a player. Um, but but yeah, we'll talk about it. Maybe Sersa can. I if Sersa says I can tell you why, then I can tell you why. But I'll shoot you a message.
You
But
can you can tell him he has a wig. I was about to say, do you want any wigs?
yeah,
You can. I
anyway,
mean,
yeah.
you can mention. It's similar to the way the Tomb of Mercy is set up, where all the characters are women.
Yeah. But I think for this one, we are going to try to play it with an all female cast. Maybe we'll switch it up. Maybe we'll talk about it. But I think it'd be interesting because I think at least as far as we've talked, yeah, we're sexist by only having women play. Yeah. Um, but but yeah. So yeah, I'm very very excited for that. We'll see what happens. And is it another is it timed like Tomb of Mercy and Necropolis?
Not as such.
Okay.
Yeah, it's you could if you wanted to make it timed, but there's not a hard time limit on this one.
Cool. Yeah. So people won't feel that kind of like. I mean, it's fun to do the time constraint, but when it's not in like a tournament setting, it's nice to be able to like be a little bit more free to explore. Because I know I would love to run Tomb of Mercy again without a time limit with people, so they would have more time to kind of find all the puzzles that they didn't find and things like that. Same thing with Necropolis. I'd love to run Necropolis over like 3 to 4 sessions and really like let people explore and dig deep into a lot of the places that they weren't able to find when they had a little bit of a time constraint. Um, so
Yeah,
it'll be interesting to see the differences now that I've run Necropolis and Tomb to then do Chapel 2 and just see because Necropolis is I mean when did Necropolis come out?
2019, I think.
No.
And it was written in 2017.
Yeah, it must have because I guess well I keep forgetting we're almost in 2022 at this point. Time
Yeah,
is not real. Time is a construct. But
yeah,
yeah, because I started the meetup at the end of 2018 and we ran it in like the I think summer of 2019, so it must have just recently come out when I picked it up. I thought it was out for longer than that. So it'll be interesting to see an adventure that you wrote in 2019 versus an adventure now that you've written that and Tomb of Mercy and done things with Cobalt Press and things like that, and then now doing this one on your own, self-publishing and everything. It'd be really really cool to um, see how it goes. Is Tomb of Mercy older than Necropolis?
yeah. Tomb of Mercy came out the year
That's
before, and
right.
it was written in 2016.
Yeah.
Chapel of Grief will be. This one's kind of like a mixture of Death Trap dungeon type stuff and roleplay type stuff. There's kind of like a mashup. So it'll be neat to see how people enjoy it.
Yeah. No, I can't tell you how excited I am for it. So,
Yeah.
and yeah, you guys will see that right here on the Adventure Archive first. And as far as if that's what Sersa wants to do as far as launching it on the day that we do the stream, then that's exactly how we're going to plan it here on the Adventure Archive. I know that, like Jason trying to call dibs in chat, like people are very excited to run any of the Sersa stuff that we can, especially within our especially here at the Adventure Archive with our community. So definitely going to have a lot of pull for that one.
Yeah, I'm pumped up. I'm glad to get it out because I have been working on this one for about 4 years now. So about time.
Yeah.
Amazing art by
And
Felicia, poetry by Aaron Kelly, who did the poetry for Testament of Malice. So we got some superstars on board for this one.
yeah, I can't wait. And again, check out Testament of Malice as well. Sersa's trap book, since we're talking about choices and traps and things like that. Just go check out his website and download everything you can and buy all the rest of it. That's pretty much what you should do. Trust me, you'll be better for it. So I think that's about. I think we tangented frequently. I think we spent about like a quarter of the time actually talking about Victory Basic on the Victory Basic chat. But I think that's gonna wrap us for the evening, and maybe we can do another one at the end after we've run the 3 sessions, and maybe we can do kind of like a wrap up kind of discussion on like different like events and choices and things like that happened over the course of the game. How'd you feel about that?
Yeah, totally. And I'm looking forward to the next prep stream. That'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So is Wednesday good for you for the next one?
Yeah, Wednesdays I usually don't have any meetings in the morning, so I'm usually pretty open.
Gotcha. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, then let's plan for Wednesday morning for those listening to wrap up the prep for the game, and I'll do some DK prep. Either earlier in the week or off stream because I don't know how far the players are going to go if they're going to survive. So we'll see what happens there. But yeah, thank you everyone that is here. Thank you everyone stuck around, and thank you Sersa for coming on. I know this is kind of reminiscent of our rogues and rants chats, which are always super super fun. So it was nice to have you on again and to be able to talk deep, not just about Victory Basic, but about game design and stuff like that too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. So we are going to raid. I think we'll just head out to Vorpal Tales, which is people we've raided before. They're playing Pathfinder right now. And then there will not be a weekly scroll tomorrow or Saturday morning. Hunter's out of town. And it's just a lot more fun when you have a co-host doing that. So we're going to take a week off, and I'm going to keep trying to edit. I need to make a command, but the podcast of the weekly scroll is up now. You can find it on Spotify, you can find it on Google, you can find it on Stitcher, and it's still waiting for approval from Apple. But the first episode is up, and then I'm going to do my best to edit the next like 5 episodes we have up and try to get those put out. So check those out. My CLA Madness is not on Monday, so you will find us next week for Dark Kingdoms and for episode 2, session 2 of Victory Basic, the game that we kind of talked about tonight. So thanks so much for being here, and we will see you next week. Bye, everybody.